All right, so I think we'll kick things off here and let everyone else kind of continue filling in. So again, my name is Rob Luzinski, and I'm with the Stewardship Network. We thank you so much for being a part of our Wetland Protection Workshop series, partnering with EGLE, Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. And with that, I would like to introduce Ann Garwood, who will be further introducing the presentation.
Hello, thanks, Rob. Hi, everyone. We're really excited for today's webinar. Thank you for attending. This is sort of a follow-up to a recent webinar we did that really gave a broad overview of federal, state, and local protection of wetlands in Michigan. And today is when we're going to start this deep dive workshop into local protection options and how to fill the gaps in protection from the state and federal level. And this is part one of a two-part workshop that we're doing. The other part is the in-person workshops, which are tomorrow and again in a couple weeks. You pick one, whichever one fits your schedule if you'd like to attend. So we're looking forward to those. Ooh. So today's webinar is going to follow this tentative agenda. We'll take a break mid-morning and a break in the mid-afternoon, and we will take an hour for lunch. So just to give you guys an idea of what we're looking at for the agenda, I'll be doing this introduction to why local protection is important, filling the gaps, and then I'll be turning it over to Kate Kirkpatrick in the Wetlands, Lakes, and Streams unit in Michigan. So I'm going to cover the current regulatory protection of wetlands, lakes, and streams in Michigan, talk about the reasons it's important for local protection to fill the gaps in those protection options, and then different ways to ensure that local protection is successful. A little bit of a review, some of the main reasons why wetlands are important on the landscape. And a lot of these are recognized in the legislative findings in the Wetlands Protection Statute in Michigan include wetlands provide flood and storm control, providing flood absorption and storage capacity. We all know they provide wildlife habitat, including breeding, nesting, and feeding grounds, cover for wildlife, waterfowl, including a lot of migratory species, and they are havens for a lot of our rare, threatened, and endangered species in Michigan. Wetlands provide protection of subsurface water resources and recharge groundwater supplies. Direct precipitation, surface runoff from uplands, groundwater seepage, and flooding from rivers are many of the ways in which they do this. Michigan's wetlands provide pollution treatment, serving as filters for chemical and biological nutrients, as well as sediment. We all know wetlands provide a lot of erosion control, certainly on certain water body types, a lot of rivers and lakes. Studies of natural and constructed wetland systems show that wetlands can remove over 90% of incoming sediment from natural runoff as well. Everyone knows that wetlands provide a lot of education, recreation, and tourism opportunities. A lot of this is really endemic to Michigan culture. Wetlands are nursery grounds and sanctuaries for fish species. They provide nesting, spawning, rearing, and cover habitat. Plants and trees in wetlands provide shade and woody debris and erosion control in a lot of our water bodies, including streams. And they provide nutrients for invertebrates, which are a food source for most of our fish species. A study that was done in 2003 of Michigan residents showed that a high percentage of Michigan residents recognized very important functions that wetlands provide, including wildlife habitat, fish habitat, flood control, wildflower habitat, and water filtration. This diagram represents sort of the state of Michigan's regulatory protection laws that exists for a lot of our surface water features. Especially for dredge and fill activities and construction activities that impact these features. As you can see, there are state laws protecting inland lakes and streams, which is Part 301, and Part 303, which protects wetlands on the landscape. However, this diagram is also used to sort of show that the landscape is complex. This isn't a simple area, and these state laws overlap with a lot of other state and federal protection laws that exist on the landscape. But this is just a summary of sort of the state of Michigan's regulatory authority at this point over many of these areas. So I'm going to recap a little bit what Part 303 Wetlands Protection Statute does protect in Michigan. The statute was written to protect the wetland functions and values provided by wetlands for the state of Michigan residents by requiring permits for activities within those wetlands. In the statute, the legislature clearly recognized the benefits of wetland functions and values in the legislative findings. Specifically, it states that a loss of a wetland may deprive the people of the state of some or all of the following benefits to be derived from a wetland. These are the things we just talked about: flood and storm control, wildlife habitat, protection of subsurface water resources and recharging groundwater supplies, pollution treatment, erosion control, and nursery grounds and sanctuaries for fish. So under the state protection law, what is a wetland? A wetland is land or water feature characterized by the presence of water at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, and that under normal circumstances does support wetland vegetation or aquatic life, and is commonly referred to as a bog, marsh, or swamp. At the state level, wetlands are regulated if they are a water of the state or water of the United States, if they are connected to or located within 1,000 feet of one of the Great Lakes or Lake St. Clair, if they're connected to or located within 500 feet of an inland lake, pond, river, or stream, if they're more than 5 acres in size, if there is a documented presence of endangered or threatened species, or if it is a rare and imperiled wetland as listed in the statute. Michigan's Wetland Protection Statute has a very specific list of regulated activities, including deposit or permit the placing of fill material in a wetland, dredge, remove, or permit the removal of soil or minerals from a wetland, construct, operate, or maintain a use or development in a wetland, and draining of surface water from a wetland. The state wetland protection statute does list quite a few specific exemptions from permits. So permits are not required for different features, uses, or activities that do not require a permit. Some of these are very basic exemptions, such as hiking, boating, or grazing, but others of the exemptions in statute have specific criteria that are often somewhat confusing and complex, including drain maintenance activities, utility installation and maintenance, incidentally created wetlands, and others. The other statute I'll briefly summarize today is the Part 301 Inland Lakes and Streams Protection Statute. This protects inland lakes and streams by regulating work on these water bodies, including dredge and fill activities similar to those in wetlands. Michigan has over 36,000 miles of streams and more than 11,000 lakes and ponds, which provide fish and wildlife habitat and recreational opportunities. Regulated activities under this statute require permits for dredging or filling of bottomland, constructing, enlarging, extending, removing, or placing a structure on bottomland, constructing, reconfiguring, or expanding a marina, creating, enlarging, or diminishing an inland lake or stream, structurally interfering with the natural flow of an inland lake or stream, constructing an artificial waterway that ultimately connects to or is within 500 feet of the ordinary high water mark of an existing inland lake or stream, and connecting any natural or artificial water with an existing inland lake or stream. So that was a short summary of the state regulatory authority that exists, but there are a lot of gaps in the activities and the water bodies that are regulated in those statutes, as we sort of briefly touched on. The importance of local protection, though, is that local governments are well suited to integrate local resource protection into land use decisions and site planning. There's a lot of local knowledge and support of these resources and the options for development of these areas. Some of the reasons that local protection are important on the landscape are that the loss of wetland functions and values can have far-reaching impacts, and they are not evenly distributed all across the state. There are cumulative impacts that the state of Michigan and many of our communities have experienced over time. The historic cumulative loss of wetlands within a watershed contributes to the loss of flood storage, water quality and pollution treatment, stream flow maintenance, sediment retention, and shoreline stabilization. This image is taken from our Status and Trends report of Michigan's wetlands, which demonstrates that loss of wetlands has been significant in the state and has mostly been most severe in the southern lower peninsula of the state of Michigan. The red represents lost wetlands on the landscape, and the green represents existing wetlands as of 2005. We also are starting to understand the impacts and implications of environmental justice on many of our communities. Many environmental justice communities may be disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards, including higher pollution burden and vulnerability. This can exacerbate the cumulative impacts of wetland losses within these communities. And when we talk about climate change and the need for climate change adaptation, the effects of climate change in Michigan are more likely to result in more severe storm events, flashier streams, and exacerbated flooding problems after storm events. Watersheds have lost significant wetlands, are not well suited to adapt to these changes, and protection and restoration of wetlands within these watersheds are recommended as primary climate change adaptation priorities. Some of the things that local protection is able to focus on include watershed management goals, flood control, water quality and runoff treatment, erosion protection, groundwater recharge, climate change adaptation, aesthetics and quality of life benefits, fish and wildlife habitat, wildflower and natural areas habitat, educational opportunities, and recreational opportunities. When focusing on lakes protection at the local level, it's important to remember that everyone has a stake in lakes protection, all levels of government, as well as the property owners and the users of those lake resources. Everyone has an interest in clean water for drinking, swimming, fishing, and boating activities. There are gaps in state and federal lake protection as well, and not all aspects of features of inland lakes are regulated under state and federal laws, which makes local protection important. Local governments are suited to fill these gaps in certain ways. They have the ability to develop future land use plans, make land use decisions, provide protection for lakes beyond statewide minimum standards, and they have local knowledge and on-the-ground resources. This is a quote from some of the guidebooks that we've provided on our website and that we've referenced in the webinar previously. It states that proactive efforts by local governments to preserve the quality of life in their communities are part of the rich history of home rule in Michigan. Local decision makers have numerous land use tools available that can help them effectively and with little cost protect sensitive landscape values to their community. Building permits, zoning authority, natural features ordinances, enforcement of the sanitary code, and soil erosion control review all fall under the authority of local government. And with each of these areas exists an opportunity to protect wetlands, lakes, and streams. Eagle has worked with partners to develop 2 guidebooks on protection of wetlands and inland lakes at the local level, which are available on our website. Broadly speaking, there are many benefits to the environment from local protection efforts. Protection of critical and unique local resources, including wetlands, lakes, streams, and other areas. Local zoning regulations can require setbacks and green belts to protect the ecological integrity of wetlands, lakes, streams, and habitat corridors, things that the state regulations do not. Local involvement also allows for early integration of environmental protection elements and best management practices during the development of site plans, referred to often as conservation planning. There are benefits to the community as a whole. They help foster better land use decisions, improving water quality, reducing flood damage, protecting wildlife habitat, and preserving valuable open space and recreational areas for the community, and increasing the dollars spent within the community on recreational activities. Local protection also reduces taxpayer dollars spent replacing those lost functions and values, preserves special features unique to that community, protects the local economy by enhancing the quality of life, and can strengthen community experiences, bringing natural experiences to the public within urban areas, creating unique identities for the community, and increasing marketing potential. On inland lakes, shoreline protection in particular can reduce the cost compared to conventional landscape maintenance for property owners, can reduce and discourage geese, has significant ecological benefits to the inland lakes and riparian wetlands, and has significant water quality benefits on our lakes. These natural shorelines remove nutrients and sediment loading to the lakes, reduce erosion and flooding, and provide wildlife access between the aquatic environment and the upland. Developers also experience some benefits from local protection efforts, including reduced cost and time delays resulting from proper planning. The local government can provide incentives in ways that the state and federal agencies can't. Avoidance and minimization efforts can expedite state and federal approval processes when tackled at the local level. Violations and conflicts with other laws can be avoided often. And in many cases, nature sells. Developments that have a lot of protected natural area around them often are very enticing to buyers. I'm going to pivot and start talking about some of the things needed to ensure that local protection efforts are successful. There's a lot of different ways to go about this, and over the years, there have been a lot of different experiences in different communities that we can learn from. So in general, ensuring success can focus on things like building community support, educating your community, understanding your options, involving the public and key stakeholders, making sure that final language in your regulations is legally defensible, and implementing and administering the protection efforts fully and fairly. Building community support can include identifying community thought leaders who will support wetlands and lakes protection, including members of the regulated community and all stakeholders, such as developers and contractors, realtors, river and lake associations, environmental groups, and citizens. Educating your community on the functions, values, costs, and benefits of these efforts. This says, do the inventory early. When you're looking at, especially when you're looking at wetland protection ordinances, you need to inventory the resources within your community, and having this completed early in the planning process and early in the stages of your protection efforts is really critical to having an open and understood conversation with the community. Utilize the word of mouth, local print and radio media within your community to get the word out about these local protection efforts. And in some cases, waging a coffee cup campaign to really encourage people to discuss the benefits of wetland and inland lakes protection in their community. It's important to understand your options to determine what's best for your community based on things like previous planning efforts, master plan or comprehensive plan you may have, remaining wetland resources within your community, input from state and federal agencies, advice from a municipal attorney, the political will in your area, and available funding. Again, it's very important to involve both the public and stakeholders within the discussions and the planning efforts for local protection of wetlands and inland lakes. We encourage that you form an advisory committee, issue public notices, and hold public meetings and hearings on all drafts. Reach out to affected stakeholders and answer all questions fully. A lot of these recommendations come from the experiences of communities that have been able to establish local protection efforts in Michigan. To reiterate, it's important to ensure that final language is legally defensible. We recommend that you utilize the model ordinance language that we provide on the State of Michigan website and in the guidebooks. Regulating the same activities that the state does can help ensure that it's defensible. Ensuring that statutory decision-making standards are the same as the state. Again, the decision-making standards relying on those state efforts can make sure that you'll be able to defend decisions within your community. And as always, consult the municipal attorney to ensure what you're doing, any changes you make are going to be in the best interest of your community. It's very important to implement and administer statutes and protection laws that you get on the books fully and fairly across the community. Consistency is critical. Having inconsistencies within these programs can cause significant issues within the community and significant issues in enforcing your protection efforts down the road. About that, enforcement and penalties are unpopular, but they're integral to having an effective protection program. In order to succeed, you must provide adequate expertise, funding, community support, and have political will. That's all I have for the introduction and sort of the recap of this series, and I will turn it over to Kate Kirkpatrick, who will dive into a lot more detail about the tools for local protection.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Kate Kirkpatrick. I'm the Wetlands Policy Analyst for the Wetlands, Lakes, and Streams Unit within Water Resources Division of EGLE. I'll be covering the tools that can be used for local protection of wetlands, inland lakes, and streams. That is my direct contact information there if anyone would like to reach out for any reason. If I don't have the answers, I can probably help get you to where you need to go. This will be our basic agenda for my presentation. We'll start with the types of tools, focusing more in depth on wetland ordinances, briefly set the stage for vernal pool protection, as one of our speakers will go into more detail about that later. We'll talk in depth natural feature setbacks and site planning, but we'll also look at other options that may be beneficial for your community. We'll talk briefly about how these tools go hand in hand with incorporating climate change concerns into local protection, and then some additional resources that you can use that we've already touched on. There will be a break in here and we'll have some time for questions at the end too. So let's dive in. So when we're talking about the types of tools that communities can use for resources protection, I do want to point out that the tools fall on a spectrum for a number of different factors. Some tools are better for wetlands, like a wetlands ordinance. Some are better for inland lakes and streams, like weed ordinances, watercraft ordinances, or keyhole ordinances. Some can be used more generally for any resource, like natural resources setbacks. And the tools can also vary with how easy they are to implement, which can also be a community decision based on time or funding. Some are rather simple and do not take a ton of effort or money, and some can be very comprehensive. Obviously, the more comprehensive, the better for the resources protection and the better for the community, as Anne explained earlier. But it is important to keep in mind that even within each tool, there can be a spectrum on implementation effort. Some tools are not going to be right for your community based on goals, values, time, money, staff, but each tool can be adjusted to better fit your community's needs. For example, one tool, like a natural feature setback, it can be 25 feet from the feature or 200 feet, or maybe both, depending on zoning or lot size. And maybe it includes all new structures, or maybe it's just as a no-mow zone. It can be very specific, or it can be very broad and flexible. Something like administration concerns, that can be done by staff you have, or maybe you'd prefer to outsource to consultants and cover that cost by including fees. So keeping in mind that spectrum, there are a number of tool options for wetlands protection, and we'll touch on these in more detail throughout the presentation. But there are wetland ordinances, linking local to state and federal permits, site plan reviews, lot division, performance guarantees, soil erosion and sedimentation control, partnerships between local units of governments and landowners. There are also a number of tool options for lakes and streams. And you'll see that some of these overlap, and so there are a few that can be used for both. But let's start by talking more specifically about wetland protection ordinances. When the legislature passed Michigan's Wetlands Protection Act 30 years ago, they recognized that wetlands on public and private land are an important part of Michigan's public waters. And Anne touched on this earlier, but to reiterate, our statute does explicitly recognize the benefit of wetland functions and values, such as flood and storm control, wildlife habitat, pollution treatment, erosion control, groundwater recharge, and fish nurseries. And our legislator did recognize that loss of wetland could deprive people of some or all of these benefits. So if this is recognized at the state level, then why create a local wetland ordinance? But the state alone does not have adequate resources to protect all wetlands. The state's jurisdiction over wetlands, not contiguous to water bodies, is limited to wetlands greater than 5 acres. The small isolated wetlands, often very valuable to the community for water quality protection, flood minimization, and wildlife habitat, may not be protected unless there is a local program. Local officials and citizens often have that local knowledge, again, of the value of wetlands within their jurisdiction, and local knowledge applied through a local program can improve wetland protection. On top of that, local officials already inspect land use activities, so they can watch for alterations to wetlands and can take steps in time to prevent irreparable harm. There are so many benefits to adding protection. We keep talking about them because they're important, but there are several benefits to the resource, the applicants, and the community. And again, for the resource, that's protecting wetlands that wouldn't be protecting otherwise. It's the catch-all for those wetlands that are important to your neighbors. They're the ones within your neighborhoods that the state isn't able to cover. The local zoning regulations can require setbacks and green belts to protect the ecological integrity of wetland systems and habitat corridors. And having that local involvement can allow for early integration of wetland protection during the development of site plans. And we'll touch more on that as we get to the tool called conservation planning. For the applicant, it's reducing cost and time delays in the long run by having a proper, well thought out plan. The local government could provide incentives. Having a complete application would expedite state application processes, which, having just come from the permit world myself, does take a lot of additional time when the resource isn't considered very well. And in that same breath, it would reduce violations or other conflicts with state and federal laws. And probably the most obvious, again, as Anne touched on earlier, nature does sell. People want that green space, they want wildlife, they want recreation, and they want those resources near them and in good health. And it forms their entire well-being, which leads to my next point. It benefits the community. There are better land use decisions that are impacting your neighbors, improving the resource by improving water quality, flood control, wildlife habitat, recreation. And by enacting wetland protection, you're not spending a ton of money trying to replace those lost functions, usually on poorly executed man-made Band-Aids. New homeowners or property owners are making informed decisions on locations that aren't going to result in leaky basements or cracking foundations. It's also encouraging a sense of place for your community, what makes it special, what makes people want to live there long-term, and in general, improved quality of life and overall well-being. Wetlands are a source of inspiration. You see it in artwork and in thriving scientific communities, and humans are drawn to these systems, and some don't realize what was so special about them until they're gone. Local governments do have the authority to protect wetlands, and that stems from the following statutes. The Michigan Wetland Protection Act, Part 303, this is what we'll be referring to the most when it comes to state regulation and wetland protection. The Michigan Environmental Protection Act, the County Rural Zoning Enabling Act of 1943, Township Rural Zoning Act of 43, and the City and Village Zoning Act of 2021. Under Part 303, there are requirements that local governments must follow when enacting a wetland ordinance. Essentially, local governments have to be as strict or stricter than our state requirements, which are derived from federal requirements. They can only regulate the same activities and make decisions in the same time frame as Part 303. They cannot regulate activities that are exempt under Part 303. They must have a wetland inventory map. They must use the joint permit application provided by the state, but you can add a supplemental page if you're asking for additional information. They must process the permit in a similar manner as other local approvals and coordinate with the state when state approval is needed. And they must use the state definition of a wetland, although obviously that can be expanded to include wetlands smaller than 5 acres. Make sure you are including a provision that allows the property owner to request a revaluation if a permit is denied. Even though they can request one anyway, you still have to include this provision in your wetland ordinance. There are often a lot of questions about the mapping requirement. It is a requirement in order to establish a wetland ordinance, but it does not have to be an expensive or complicated process. There are a ton of online resources available. Eagle has an online wetlands map viewer. But something to note here, this is not supposed to be a jurisdictional map. It's not making a call on whether this wetland is regulated or not. It's just supposed to inform your community where there may be wetlands. And it may seem like an extra or unnecessary step, but as someone who gets wetland real estate calls constantly, having a map just makes sense. It builds awareness of the wetland resources in the community. It builds support for protection among stakeholders to see what resources you have, what resources you have left. And then you can see as a community where you can grow, how you can grow, what you want to remain the same. It helps inform your community's master plan for the next 5, 10, 50 years, however many years you're looking into the future. Another thing to note, don't forget the map disclaimer. The maps are a basic inventory for planning purposes. They're not the substitute for an on-site review. So this is an example of a disclaimer that a local government can include with their inventory map. It reads, as stipulated by Part 303, this inventory map does not necessarily include all of the wetlands within the municipality that may be subject to the wetland ordinance. Furthermore, this inventory does not create any legally enforceable presumptions regarding whether property that is or is not included on the inventory map is or is not in fact a wetland. Therefore, this inventory is to be considered non-jurisdictional, and all wetland boundaries regulated by this ordinance must be determined through an on-site review by the municipality. So this here is an important consideration under wetland ordinances. So there are some special considerations for wetlands under 2 acres in total size. The 5-acre wetland size minimum in Part 303 is not based on science. It was a magic number that was based on political compromise. And so we know that small isolated wetlands provide valuable functions, and even more so as a community becomes more developed. These small wetlands are still very important for flood storage and habitat, and the local government is well suited to protecting these more so than the state. If a local government is going to include wetland under 2 acres into their wetland ordinance, as is recommended, there is an essentiality requirement, which basically states that a local government has to issue a permit to impact that small wetland unless it is determined that the wetland is essential to the preservation of the community's natural resources. Now, the essentiality requirement includes all of the following: threatened or endangered plant, fish, or animal species, locally rare ecosystems, plants or animals of identified local importance, documented groundwater recharge, flood and stormwater control, breeding, feeding, nesting grounds for wildlife, protects subsurface water supplies, pollution treatment by serving as a biological and chemical oxidation basin, erosion control by absorbing silt and organic matter, sources of nutrients and water food cycles. Now, since all of what I just listed is basically what any wetland can do, this is a very easy hurdle. By definition, a wetland does provide flood storage capacity, pollution treatment, sediment absorption, wildlife habitat. And so the essentiality requirement is not difficult to meet, and you just need one of what I mentioned before in the last 2 slides. Vernal pools. With that in mind, I want to highlight the importance of vernal pools really quick. We will have a more in-depth presentation on this later, but it's important for you to know that vernal pools are highly valuable systems that may not be regulated under state and federal law because they are often isolated and smaller than 5 acres in size, and often smaller than 2 acres in size. Vernal pools, however, easily meet that essentiality requirement. A takeaway here, though, is just coordinate with Eagle if you need help. Once you have your ordinance, you'll want to notify Eagle. Use the application forms provided by Eagle. For those wetland that Eagle has jurisdiction over, the applicant should use our joint permit application on My Waters. If the wetland is not regulated by the state, you can use a PDF copy of our form and include an additional attachment if you require more information on that form. There are model ordinances that are available on Eagle's website, on the Huron River Watershed Council's website as well. And this will help get you started in drafting those ordinances. But most municipalities have their local ordinances easy to search online. We do have a list on Eagle's website. Things to note when developing an ordinance: incorporate language from the model. Gather input from all stakeholders, including businesses, colleges, interest groups, and the general public. Establish some reasonable goals and timelines. Maintain economic viability of properties, but keep in mind that our Part 303 exemptions, which local ordinances would be required to adhere to, do have that economic viability worked in. Be consistent. Constantly communicate and educate, and have your attorney review the model to ensure that it lines up with state and federal requirements. A big question is, what are the costs of enacting an ordinance? With any program, with any change, really, there is education and outreach, writing and revisions, public hearings and meetings, mapping, administration, enforcement. And with all of this comes staff time and or potentially the use of professional consultants. Other perceived costs include the idea that it will slow a community's growth, but wetland ordinances do not prevent growth. They help prevent poor planning and can encourage growth in a responsible way. Some worry that they'll bring on more lawsuits and will bankrupt the community. But a well-crafted and fairly administered wetland ordinance is easily defensible and rarely challenged. A local government is much less vulnerable if it develops a master plan that shows how it wants the community to be developed and environmental resources protected. Judges will defer to communities when they see the connection between a regulation, such as a wetlands ordinance, and the overall plan. The Huron River Watershed Council conducted a review of legal challenges to local wetland regulations over 20 years, and they did not find a single instance in which a local wetlands ordinance was struck down by Michigan courts as being unconstitutional. Another claim is that these regulations aren't popular, but I think you'll find that the opposite is true. And as long as you communicate, educate, and develop good relationships with the stakeholders in your community, you'll have the support. Now, as for the monetary costs, these can be substantially covered in different ways. They can be covered with efficient management, and that can include partnering with other local organizations, utilizing EGLE, or processing these permits in conjunction with a zoning permit. You can include these costs in the budget or as part of a general fund. You can use permit application fees or escrow accounts to help offset costs. And you can use fines to offset enforcement costs as well. But above all, consider the cost of doing nothing. Is it worth the flooding, degraded water quality, loss of quality of life, loss of recreation, sense of place? I don't think so, but that is something for you to determine as a community. Okay, so moving on from developing a wetland ordinance, that's one tool. Another tool to use is a natural feature setback, and we'll take a quick break after we get through this section here. So what is a natural feature setback? It is a building or principal use limitation or restriction a certain distance from a wetland or other natural feature, like a lake, stream, dune, forested area. It can be all-encompassing. It is not part of a wetland regulatory permit program. State and federal regulations are up to the wetland boundary or below the ordinary high water mark. There is no setback feature. So this is one area where local communities can improve and expand on natural resources protection. But this is typically done through a zoning ordinance. A typical setback amount is between 25, 40 feet, although lake setbacks are usually larger. And the purpose of a setback is to separate two land uses so that conflicts and impacts are minimized. The setback can be used to control access and encroachment to the buffer and to adjacent natural areas. They provide important corridor habitat that connects wetlands and uplands, and it promotes the retention and use of native vegetation. And if you think back to your ecology or biology classes, there is something called the edge effect, which is studied a lot in ecology, and studies have shown that there can be significant changes in wildlife and plant communities at the boundary of two habitat types. And the smaller the habitat fragment, for example, a small wetland or vernal pond fragment, the more pronounced those changes are. Edges become areas with increased noise, light pollution, human recreation, roadkill. The increased human activity can cause some species to move further inland away from those habitat edges. So even though our state regulations protect up to the wetland boundary or below the ordinary high water mark, there are still impacts to that natural feature that result in encroachment, reduce biodiversity, lower habitat quality, essentially creating this dead zone so that impact is so much greater than what we can clearly see. So by utilizing a natural feature setback as a tool, we're promoting all of these different benefits to the resource and to the community. There's protection of surface water runoff, improved water quality for pollution prevention, water recharge, water storage, stabilization of sediment and erosion prevention, habitat, aesthetics, the increased enjoyment of natural resources and recreational opportunities. It preserves the unique community features and then overall contributes to that sense of place you feel with your community. And what's great about this type of ordinance is that it's pretty flexible. It can be tailored to the community's needs. You want to protect your forested areas, include that as a natural feature. You have small lot sizes, then you can shorten the setback for parcels smaller than ½ an acre. Include it for lakes, rivers, streams, slopes, wetlands, whatever your community determines is important. Here's a waterfront greenbelt setback example utilized by Boyne Valley Township and Hayes Township in Charlevoix County. These were the requirements they used in their setback ordinance. They used a 50-foot area starting from the ordinary high water mark of a lake or stream. There were no structures allowed within the setback, no dredging or filling within the setback. The use of asphalt, concrete, rock was limited to a single walkway, no more than 4 feet in width. Within 35 feet of the ordinary high water mark, a natural vegetation strip, not mowed lawn or native vegetation strip, shall be established and maintained on at least 70% of the lake or stream frontage for any new construction or renovation, increasing the structure footprint by 500 square feet or greater. And then no pesticides or herbicides were allowed within the vegetation strip. There are a couple models that you can take a look at for good examples, and we'll hear more about the West Bloomfield Township from one of our speakers later. And Ann Arbor Township natural feature setbacks on the Huron River Watershed Council's website is also a good example. Okay, everybody, welcome back. And just to give you an idea of where we're at in this presentation, we're going to talk about other tools like linking local protection to state and federal approvals, site planning. We'll go in depth about all those. We'll talk about options and how climate change can be involved in this process, and then some additional resources for you to use. So linking local approvals to state permits. I just want to mention this first because if we're talking about our spectrum, again, this tool is definitely the easiest and quickest way to provide some additional protection to wetlands at the local level. But again, it doesn't fill all of those gaps. What this is referring to is basically placing a stipulation in your zoning building ordinances that you require issuance of a state permit prior to issuing any local permits. The advantages, it ensures issues are considered early in the planning process. It facilitates better communication between local, state, and federal agencies. It ensures that resources are regulated at a minimum to state and local requirements. And it's inexpensive to administer because you're just really asking for proof of a permit from the state prior to issuing your own. However, as the disadvantages state here, you are therefore leaving the decision of the permit to the state with a statewide and regional perspective. EGLE is not considering your master plan. They're not considering your community's goals and values. We're issuing or denying a permit for your community and many, many others at the same time based on statutory requirements. And those requirements, as we discussed earlier, may be missing some important resources that deserve your protection at the local level. Site plan review regulations. Site plans are the documents and drawings that have that information showing what an applicant for zoning approval is proposing on a parcel of land. Thorough site plans are going to include information on stormwater patterns, topography, soils, and the best site plans are going to include wetland information like type and boundaries, lakes and stream locations, floodplain elevations, critical habitats, etc. Site plan review regulations are going to be provisions in a zoning ordinance looking at the physical layout of the proposed project and ensuring that the zoning ordinance standards are being adhered to. A lot of local governments already do this as part of their planning process, so adding on a wetland review typically does not add too much work to the process. Some considerations for adding the wetland review to site plan review regulations is that it may require professional assistance and training decision makers in order to be used effectively. You may need to hire outside consultants with the cost being offset by fees paid by the applicants. And including standards within site plan review regulations is essential to ensure effective and legally rooted review decisions. Standards could include data submission, non-discretionary or discretional, conditional standards, all to ensure the ordinance conformance. The discretionary standards would address issues ranging from impacts on the environment in conformance with any state regulations. And if the development doesn't adhere to the approved site plans, then enforcement could then be legally pursued. Performance-based zoning. Performance-based zoning is unique in that it does not divide land use into separate zoning districts, which is typical. The traditional approach is to design specific land use activities in predefined geographic zones like commercial, residential, industrial. But performance-based regulates land use by particular predefined standards to which developers must adhere to. And this includes wetland protection and waterfront setbacks. A significant benefit is that it allows communities to promote infill. So you're developing vacant or underutilized parcels within existing urban areas that are already largely developed, and you're reducing your sprawl. So what it does is it actually gives developers a certain degree of flexibility in designing a plan and locating an appropriate site, as long as all those conditions laid out by the local government are met. So some examples of performance standards that protect the resources are wetland protection, amount of impervious surface, building density, waterfront setbacks, buffering requirements, and open space ratios. Performance guarantees. Performance guarantees are an interesting tool to use for resource protection and a pretty smart one. A lot of violations, resource violations, come from projects that aren't properly constructed. The performance guarantees are essentially a form of insurance collected by the local government to ensure that the project is constructed correctly, or they're used as a way to protect a community from unmarketable sites due to project abandonment or partial completion. And you can require these guarantees in the form of surety bonds, cash equivalents. And communities interested in this tool should include in their local zoning, condominium, or subdivision ordinances some standards that have been predefined and guide these guarantees, like ensuring that a stormwater basin is constructed correctly and that the stormwater is treated properly before entering a wetland. You can establish timelines for project completion and the resulting penalties if the standards are not met. If the project is completed according to standards, then the guarantee is released. If not, the guarantee funds can be obtained by the municipality and the project can be completed with their own hired contractor. But obviously it is important that these projects are valued reasonably and accurately. Lot split or lot division regulations. Issues arising from poor planning of land division come up a lot in the district with Eagle permit staff. And these types of regulations can save a lot of heartache. They're important because they can prevent lot splits that create unbuildable lots with mostly wetland, or the lots are not of sufficient size, or the wetlands are situated in a way that in order to construct a home, significant impacts would have to occur, or the site is limited due to severe slopes, etc. These regulations can ensure that access meets minimum public safety requirements and drainage standards. They can prevent the unnecessary fragmentation of valuable natural resource areas and prevent other overdevelopment along rural corridors. Splits can look at drainage ditches, natural water courses, easements, or public right-of-ways to ensure that a split wouldn't conflict with any of those. Environmental planning in public infrastructure projects. So this is necessary for any growing community. Public infrastructure inevitably needs to be upgraded or expanded. And so one of the responsibilities of the local government is to plan this growth and direct it into areas that will have the lowest environmental impact. Sewer systems are a great example of this. When sewers are installed in wetland areas, which are areas considered unsuitable for on-site septic, it tends to direct development into those areas. So that's why having a master plan is important. It's important that it includes a sewer facility plan. And the extent of municipal sewers should be determined in part by the need to protect drinking water, lakes, streams, wetlands, which is one of the two primary reasons we have sewer systems in the first place, is to protect those resources and obviously for our own health. Open space zoning and conservation design. This is a big one. Open space zoning regulations are techniques used by communities to accommodate growth while preserving wetland and other natural resources, rural character, prime agricultural and forest lands, scenic views, historic landmarks, and other special features that are important to the community. This type of zoning requires that a certain percentage of a site is preserved as open space to protect those resources. And there are 4 fundamental components of open space zoning. 1, the special site features are inventoried and mapped. 2, a significant portion of the site is protected as permanent open space. Oh, I switched those up a little bit, but building envelopes are cited to respect special features and preserve the quantity and quality of open space on the site. And 4, view sheds are protected by maintaining a low visual impact, particularly along public roadways and water features. There are some different techniques that can protect both open spaces and wetlands. Conservation subdivision or clustering allows for grouping of building sites together and provides a more compact site design that can lower the cost of infrastructure, surveying, engineering. And open space zoning can reduce the lot size, but the open space adjacent to and surrounding these lots does give the sense of much larger lots. Not to mention it's more desirable in terms of feelings of privacy, recreation, etc. Conservation easements, these can be used to provide permanent and perpetual land protection, deed restrictions, planned use developments. These encourage site design that integrates structures and uses with natural site characteristics to minimize impacts on the site. So here is an example of a boring traditional subdivision design. It's got the grid layout, very little regard for natural and special features. It will inevitably destroy everything within those lots. But when you take the time to map out the special features on site, all of the natural resources that we want to protect, and also taking into consideration things like the view shed and any natural feature setbacks, you do end up with a lovely place to live, and one that provides equal access to the shoreline, provides privacy, scenic views, lots of open space and conservation design. And here we see some improved recreational options as well with a trail design system. And then you add in some community amenities. And in the end, what all this adds up to, you've got preservation of natural features, plus private lots and common areas, plus increased sense of community and social opportunities, plus shoreline use, minimize shoreline use, that equals higher property values. So those were all very good tools that are great for more wetland specific protection. We are going to go through some other tools that are great for lakes and streams protection in addition to wetland protection. So erosion and sedimentation control ordinance. Sediment can wreak havoc on both wetland systems and lakes and streams. It reduces water depths, increases turbidity, reduces water clarity, smothers plant and animal species, just overall reduces water quality. Additionally, it typically, and especially on a construction site, will contain contaminants like pesticides, heavy metals, oil and grease, bacteria, other chemicals. Part 91, the soil erosion and sedimentation control, gives the primary responsibility for administering the statute to protect water resources from unchecked soil erosion to the counties. The County Board of Commissioners must designate a county enforcing agency, like a building department or a local soil conservation district. They will designate that agency to administer the soil erosion program on behalf of the county. Permits are required for all regulated activities, all earth changes that disturb 1 or more acres or that are within 500 feet of a lake or stream. And since wetlands are often contiguous to lakes and streams, SESC ordinances can easily include wetlands into their local protection. The county or local government can require SESC permits within 500 feet of wetlands, lakes, or streams. Part 91 does allow cities, villages, charter townships, and some general law townships to assume responsibility within their jurisdictions by adopting an EGLE-approved SESC ordinance. And these costs are typically offset by charging fees for inspections, permits, or plan reviews. Watercraft ordinance. Local governments can work with the Department of Natural Resources, the DNR, to establish a watercraft control ordinance to address conflict between high-speed boaters, water skiers, swimmers, fishermen, and others. This is regulated under Part 801, Marine Safety, and is administered by DNR's Law Enforcement Division. There are different ways you can establish a watercraft ordinance. You can establish vessel speed limits. You can prohibit use of certain types of vessels. And these restrictions can pertain to all or part of the water body and during specified hours of the day or specified days of the week. There is a section in Part 801 that the vessel owner is responsible for any damage caused by a vessel wake. So this is a great way to have statutory support for limiting excessive watercraft use that results in high wave energy and increased shoreline erosion. It does say in statute, the owner of any vessel operate upon the waters of the state is personally responsible for any damage to life or property resulting from a wake or swell created by the negligent operation or propulsion of the vessel if the vessel is being operated with his or her consent. Keyhole ordinances. So keyhole development, also called funnel development, is the development of a large parcel that has a relatively small, narrow frontage on a body of water and is used more heavily than is typical from a single family lot. These developments often include condominiums, campgrounds, or planned unit developments, and they often accommodate access by owners, residents, and guests. There are several conflicts that can arise from these developments, such as increased boating traffic, increased shoreline erosion from boating activity, other water quality impacts, noise, navigation issues. And local governments can alleviate some of these conflicts by establishing things like lot width requirements for access per dwelling unit. They can set limits on motorized to non-motorized watercraft ratios. So for access, undeveloped deeded lots, for example, may not be used to access property except in accordance with specific provisions. An example for lot width, not more than one single family home may gain water access for each 100 feet of the lake. Or the parcel should contain at least 70 feet of water frontage and a lot depth of at least 100 feet for access privileges. Per dock, docks could be separated by a minimum of 30 feet is a typical example, or not more than 2 boat parking spaces may be provided for each 100 foot of lake frontage, or the legal resident of the lot must own all the boats stored on the lot. And so a carrying capacity analysis can then provide a basis for these standards. A carrying capacity analysis is done by calculating a usable lake area that could support a range of boating activities or speeds safely and without significant environmental impacts. It is establishing minimum spatial requirements for various boating activities. It's determining the number of watercraft that use the lake during periods of peak use and the relative proportions of those watercraft engaged in different activities. It's comparing the actual use to the lake's estimated carrying capacity. And a logical basis of the ordinance is pretty much a necessity, as a court may find an ordinance unreasonable or arbitrary and invalid without that data to back it up and documentation of the existing problems. So you can use area growth trends, which are lakefront housing trends in proximity to the lake, or boat registration trends. You can use lake characteristics like watershed size, lake area, depth, bottom substrate, aquatic plants, invasive species, water quality, bathymetry, shoreline types, land use and cover types. You can use lake user groups or dynamics, collect surveys on who is using the lake and for what. Is it mainly riparians? Is it mainly people that are using the public access site, if there is one? Fishing, water skiing, swimming, etc. Are there existing lake use zonings in place, like no wake areas? And how do competing user groups feel about the lake usage? The recreational carrying capacity, that's determining how many watercraft can simultaneously operate on the lake without, one, compromising user safety, two, causing significant user displacement or dissatisfaction, three, causing environmental harm to the resource. But an ordinance like this should clearly articulate standards and address the specific needs. And obviously there is no one size fits all solution for all water bodies. Structure size and location restrictions can be a part of these keyhole ordinances. For example, limit use of a permanent structure over a certain size. You can limit where they are placed due to safety or use concerns. And you can limit length and orientation of docks. Think about how the length and shape of the dock is going to allow more or less watercraft to moor. And moving on to floodplain management. So floodplain management is a public health and safety matter. The floodplains are natural low areas adjacent to water bodies. So it is estimated that 80% of wetlands exist within the 100-year floodplain. And when floodplains are altered by development, their ability to handle floodwaters are greatly reduced. And so flooding is more common, and subsequently disastrous community damage can occur from removing these essential resources. Some goals of floodplain management are to limit the alteration of natural floodplains, wetlands, and slopes that store and attenuate floodwaters. Control activities like filling, grading, and dredging. Prevent encroachment on stream channels and wetlands. Prevent construction of flood barriers that will unnaturally divert waters like dams or poorly sized culverts. And save community dollars by preserving flood protection features. And there are a number of options available for floodplain protection. One of the first steps is to delineate the floodplain area on an official map, which then becomes the basis for your local regulations. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Act, has mapped a lot of these areas already. However, many smaller streams and tributaries are still not mapped. Governments can regulate development in floodplains through a separate floodplain ordinance or through special provisions in the zoning ordinance or building code. Floodplain zoning ordinances regulate the types of land uses that are permitted in the floodplain. And so floodplain zoning districts allow uses that are not susceptible to flood damage, like recreation, agriculture, or some planned use developments that are clustered out of flood-prone areas. The building code provisions can require something like any new structures must be constructed above the 100-year floodplain elevation. And planning involving floodplains can look like targeting the acquisition of floodplain areas for use as passive nature recreation areas, or for more intensive forms of recreation that are not permanently damaged by flooding, like softball or soccer fields. And these lands can often be purchased at reduced prices. Strategic acquisition can also significantly contribute to the protection of riparian wetlands. Stormwater management. The stormwater management regulations are designed to address the challenges posed by flooding and non-point source pollution. The term non-point refers to pollutants that originate from diffuse sources rather than a specific point or an easily identified source, like from A non-point source example is snow melt or stormwater runoff versus an outlet pipe. Stormwater runoff can carry high concentrations of sediment, hydrocarbons, hazardous chemicals, pesticides, bacteria, nutrients, heavy metals. And so local governments are becoming increasingly involved in the administration of stormwater management activities, particularly in rapidly urbanizing areas where the impacts of development on water quality and quantity are the most pronounced. In many areas of Michigan, polluted runoff from lawns, roads, and agriculture account for as much as 70% of water quality problems of a waterway. And as little as 10% of impervious surface cover can cause water quality and habitat degradation. Here are some good examples of stormwater management considerations. You control quantity, timing, and quality of runoff. Consider watershed and wetland boundaries in planning over township boundaries and county lines. Prohibit the discharge of stormwater to wetlands and the use of natural wetlands to treat stormwater. Instead, encourage low impact development, which can include creation of rain gardens, green roofs, wet detention basins, and other engineered solutions through the local area. Set a limit for impervious areas and require pervious services wherever possible. And ensure proper installation and require routine maintenance of stormwater control measures. Weed regulations. So natural landscaping along a lake shoreline mimics natural conditions with native plants and provides a buffer for the lake. It filters pollutants and reduces erosion. It does not pose the hazards that a lot of weed laws in effect are intended to address. So many communities have weed ordinances that simply prevent all weeds over an arbitrary height and doesn't distinguish between the native versus non-native species. So a good recommendation is to consider using a less prohibitive ordinance that allows native landscapes and distinguishes between the two. And here, again, we have a spectrum of weed regulations. The more prohibited is all weeds over an arbitrary height. And then somewhere in the middle, modifying it to grant permission for native landscapes without application approval by the neighborhood or governing body. And then less prohibitive end of the spectrum is that native landscapes are actively promoted while non-native vegetation is restricted. Aquatic invasive species. Aquatic invasive plants and animals like zebra mussels or Eurasian water milfoil pose a significant threat to Michigan's inland lakes. And once introduced into a water body, they affect water quality and impact recreation. So effective and enforceable local ordinances are a key part of preventing the spread of existing aquatic invasive species or the introduction of a new species. These types of ordinances protect public health, safety, welfare. They prevent water pollution and protect habitat. So several townships in Michigan have enacted such ordinances with provisions that require the washing of boats and trailers when they are moved from one lake to the next, and they prohibit emptying of bait boxes and aquariums into local waterways. Some communities also provide watercraft washing stations and signage, educating boaters on how to prevent the spread of invasive species. And that is an example of a typical sign that you would see from the DNR. Septic system regulations. Failing septic systems can introduce human pathogens into the environment. They contaminate home water wells and negatively impact adjacent lakes, streams, and wetlands. So failing septic systems near lakes, streams, and wetlands can leach phosphorus and nitrogen into those waters that then in turn lead to excessive plant growth, depletion of dissolved oxygen, and eutrophication. So local communities are beginning to pass time of sale septic ordinances. Time of sale ordinances require a local inspection of well and septic systems prior to the sale of the property or when a title is transferred. And they identify well and septic systems that are no longer functioning as designed or were installed without regard to the code. And they require action if necessary. Older systems are typically grandfathered in as long as they're still functioning, but a failing system would require repair or replacement within a certain time frame. Okay, so that was a quick summary, a basic summary of what we've identified as important tools available to local governments for water resources protection. Now, climate change resiliency is inherent in each of those tools, and a lot of communities are expressing concern at how climate change is affecting their community. So the Association of State Wetland Managers developed a white paper called Climate Change Adaptation for inland and coastal wetlands in the state of Michigan. And it outlines the climate change predictions specifically for Michigan's wetlands, and it identifies adaptation strategies and recommendations for land managers and Michigan agencies. The plan focuses on recommendations for adaptations in 5 main focus areas: advanced strategic planning, monitoring and assessment, voluntary restoration, conservation and management, regulation, and integration with other water programs for watershed management. Some of the recommendations include development of an internet-based GIS tool that is continually updated with information like temperature, precipitation, water levels, vegetation cover, ice and snow cover, etc. This is a good way to collect and monitor your local changes. Research specific climate change vulnerabilities by wetland type, which if developing a local wetland inventory, it would be great to know whether your community contains wetland types that are at a higher risk from climate change. And that may help inform your planning in terms of which features are more of a priority to you. Supporting existing programs, which conserve and restore wildlife habitat corridors. And we've discussed a few tools that help accomplish this, like with natural feature setbacks, floodplain ordinances, conservation planning. And in cooperation with stakeholders, integrate climate change adaptation into regulatory process through permitting, enforcement, and mitigation. The tools are a great way to do this. So wrapping up in a minute, there are some additional resources you have available to you. We've mentioned these before. These are all online. There are several guidebooks that go into better detail on all of the tools and strategies we discussed here today. We will have some available at the in-person workshops tomorrow if you're able to attend. I do recommend it. You can also check out our Eagle website for some additional information, and that is my contact information again. So feel free to reach out for any questions. And that is all I have for us today. I think we're ahead of schedule, but we do have time for a Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes.
All right, this is Anne. We do have some time for questions about this morning's presentations. It can be about anything that Kate covered or I covered this morning if you guys would like to ask questions about it. And just to reiterate, after lunch, we do have three partners that are going to be giving presentations in a little bit more detail, in particular about some case studies for examples of local protection in Michigan. So we are looking forward to those as well. Right now, I don't see a lot of questions in the Q&A or in the chat. There's one question in the chat about what would be an example of a wetland type that's more vulnerable to climate change. I will tackle that a little bit. I will say that's a little bit outside the scope of this presentation since we are focused mostly on different protection options for local governments. But for example, wetlands that are driven, whose hydrology is particularly sensitive to flashy storm events or drought events, for example. A lot of those, they can be groundwater systems, or they could be wetlands that are on water bodies that would potentially experience significant flooding or erosion during heavier storm events or more extreme storm events. Those are going to be the types of wetlands that may be more vulnerable to climate change. I'm not going to get into like specifics about what types because it can vary across the landscape and have a lot to do with the hydrology sources in the local area. But if there are any other questions out there, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. All right, and if there aren't, oh, there's one. Barbara asks, are there agencies or law offices that can assist a citizen to navigate the plethora of regulations and jurisdictions? Example, county drain causing erosion. So there's quite a bit of information that has been compiled on the websites, both the state websites and some of the local organizations. And a lot of that information is intended to make it easier to navigate these things, but there's also district offices at the state level that are familiar with local regulations or familiar with the local issues. And I would recommend that you start there. Kate or Amy, I wondered if you guys wanted to add anything to that.
So, Anne, the only other thing I might add is that depending on where you live, and you'll hear more about this afternoon, your local watershed council often is familiar with state regulations and different ways that citizens can get involved in the regulatory process. So that's probably, if I was you, that's probably where I would start.
Yeah, I agree. The local watershed groups are a great resource for that too. And I did include the link to our district staff in the chat.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us again after lunch. This is Ann Garwood and Kate Kirkpatrick again. We are very excited to have a few partners with us to continue talking about local protection of wetlands, lakes, and streams, and the importance of protecting local resources and how to do that. Hoping to have some good case studies for discussion this afternoon, and we really appreciate everyone coming back after lunch. Our first speaker is Yuman Lee, and we're very excited to hear her talk about vernal pools. Thanks, Yuman.
Thanks, Anne. And thanks to Eagle and the Stewardship Network for the invitation and opportunity to share information with you today about vernal pools and how we can better protect them at the local level. Just a little background on who I am. I'm a conservation scientist and zoologist with the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, or MNFI, which is a program of MSU Extension, and it's we're Michigan's Natural Heritage Program. My main area of expertise is the ecology and conservation of amphibians and reptiles and their habitats, which includes, of course, wetlands. I've been mapping and monitoring and researching vernal pools and conducting trainings and presentations on vernal pools since 2011. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Michigan Vernal Pools Partnership, and I also help coordinate the Michigan Vernal Pool Patrol, which I'll be talking about later in the presentation. So the plan for my presentation is that we're going to start off talking about what a vernal pool is and some of their key characteristics. And then we'll talk a little bit about why vernal pools are important. And then we'll talk also about their status and some of the threats that are facing vernal pools, and then some of the ongoing efforts to try to conserve them in Michigan. And then we'll talk about some options for protecting vernal pools at the local level and how local protection is really key for vernal pools. So what is a vernal pool? Vernal pools are a special type of wetland that is seasonally flooded. So they're wet for part of the year and then they're dry for the other part of the year. These wetlands are naturally occurring and they're typically associated with forested landscapes in Michigan and the glaciated Northeast. They're generally small and shallow, and they usually occur in a depression or a basin. Because they dry up, fish can't survive in them. And because fish can be really voracious predators in wetland and aquatic ecosystems, without fish predation, and that allows this allows some species to live in vernal pools that they couldn't survive in other wetlands or water bodies, or they do better in vernal pools than other wetlands or water bodies that have fish predators. And that allows for some really unique species to occur in vernal pools and some really diverse wildlife to occur there. So let's talk a little bit more about some of those key characteristics then. So like I mentioned, vernal pools are seasonally flooded. So they usually fill with water and they're wet in the spring, but they also can fill with water in late fall or winter. And then they usually dry up by late summer or early fall. So you can see in the slide here, there's a vernal pool that was wet in the spring in early May on the left. And then by late June, in this case, it was dry then, this vernal pool. So usually they dry up every year. There are some vernal pools that are called semi-permanent vernal pools that don't dry up every year. So maybe every 3 out of 5 years or 5 out of 10 years, or only during drought years. And in Michigan, our definition for vernal pools is that they have to hold water for at least 2 months in the spring. So vernal pools get their water from a variety of sources, depending on the vernal pool. A lot of vernal pools get their water from precipitation, so the rain or snow melt, which is a major source of input for many wetlands. Some vernal pools actually are connected to and do get some input from the groundwater. And some vernal pools get runoff from surface water. There are some vernal pools that occur along rivers or streams, and they, when the river floods in the spring, it overflows the bank, and then that's how they fill up. And there are some vernal pools that have intermittent streams that flow into or flow into them. Vernal pools, like I mentioned, are usually pretty small and shallow. So generally they're less than 2.5 acres. Most actually are probably smaller than even a 1/4 acre. And most of them are pretty shallow, less than 3 feet or 1 meter deep. And vernal pools are generally geographically isolated. So that is that they often occur in sort of these upland forest situations, and they don't have any kind of connection then, at least through surface water, to any permanent water or wetlands. Although sometimes they can be connected to other wetlands or water bodies, like we talked about with the vernal pools that occur along rivers that would be temporarily connected to the river in the spring when it's flooded, and then they become, disconnected then after the water level goes down in the river. And then there are some vernal pools that have these intermittent or temporary inlets or outlets that flow into or out of the vernal pools. But even though they're geographically isolated, and they may not be connected to other wetlands or water bodies through surface water, we mentioned that some of them can be connected to the groundwater table, and that they are part of the surrounding forest ecosystem and the watershed. So they are connected either hydrologically, maybe through groundwater, or sometimes surface water, but they also are connected biologically to the surrounding forest and watershed. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And because vernal pools lack fish, they allow some species to survive or to thrive in these wetlands that would not occur in other wetlands or water bodies that have fish predators. And these species also have to be adapted or specialized for living in these wetlands that are dry and wet for part of the year then. And so in Michigan, there are 4 species that we consider what we call vernal pool indicator or obligate species. So these species will either only occur in vernal pools, or they rely on vernal pools for their survival, or they do better in vernal pools because of that lack of fish predators then. And so in Michigan, the 4 species we think of as vernal pool indicator species are the fairy shrimp, blue spotted salamander, and the wood frog, which are shown here. So fairy shrimp are these little freshwater crustaceans. They get to be about an inch long, and they only live in vernal pools. So they overwinter as eggs on the bottom of the pool when the pool is dry, and the eggs actually have to dry. And in some cases, they have to freeze before they'll actually hatch the following spring when the pool fills with water, when the pool thaws in the spring then. And then the adults only live in the vernal pools for about 2 to 4 weeks or so. They mate, they lay their eggs, and then the adults die. And then you won't see them again until the following spring when the pool fills back up with water. The other 3 species, the blue spotted salamander, and wood frog, they can breed. So they use vernal pools for breeding primarily. They can breed in other wetland types that are not vernal pools, but they really do the best, have the highest survival rates in vernal pools, their eggs and their larvae, because of that lack of fish then. So these species will come to the vernal pools early in the spring as soon as the vernal pool fills up with water or thaws. And then the adults breed, they lay their eggs, and the eggs and the larvae develop in the pool, and then they metamorphose and turn into adults and leave the vernal pool by July and August, hopefully before the pool dries up then. But I do want to mention that not all vernal pools will contain, these indicator species. They might only contain one or a couple of them, or maybe none of them then. So just to keep that in mind. And also wanted to just mention that the amphibians that we talked about that use these vernal pools, again, they're only in the vernal pools during the spring when they're breeding for a couple weeks of the year. And then the rest of the time they're in that, living in that surrounding forest. And some of them can travel pretty far, up to 300 meters from the vernal pool then. That's important to keep in mind, because a lot of our current buffers for vernal pools are much smaller, usually only about 30 meters or 100 feet or so. And in the last 10 or 20 years, we've started to really better understand and recognize the importance of vernal pools. And that's related to kind of 3 main areas. One is that they provide critical habitat for wildlife. They also provide important ecosystem services. And they also have some really important, I think, educational and recreational values. So as we talked about in terms of the indicator species, but in addition to those indicator species, vernal pools really provide critical breeding and also just general habitat for a number of invertebrates and amphibians. And in some cases, vernal pools may be the only sources of water in some of those forested areas for some of these invertebrates and amphibians to breed. And then there are a number of other wildlife species that also use vernal pools, either for water or for feeding or for dispersal. And so there have been over 550 different animal species that have been documented using vernal pools in the Northeast US. And there are also a number of rare species in Michigan that are associated with vernal pools. So some of the ones that are shown here, so that includes the Blanding's turtle and spotted turtle, which use vernal pools a lot in the spring. We have a couple of state endangered salamanders, like the smallmouth salamander, that also use vernal pools for breeding. There's a federal listed snake species, the Cobberley water snake, which use vernal pools for feeding in the spring. And even some of other taxa like red-shouldered hawks, which will feed on amphibians, can occur near vernal pools then. And part of what contributes to the really high biodiversity in vernal pools relates to this annual water cycle that all vernal pools go through, and different environmental and habitat conditions that are associated with the different stages that are shown here on this slide. And there are certain species, for example, that hatch or arrive at the vernal pools as soon as the pool fills with water or thaws in early spring. And that includes the indicator species like we talked about, the wood frogs, spotted salamanders, and blue spotted salamanders, which come in early spring to breed and lay their eggs. And also like the fairy shrimp and a number of these really tiny invertebrates or crustaceans like Daphnia and copepods, and of course, mosquito larvae, which then provide food for other animals. And then the spotted and blanding turtles come to the vernal pools to feed in the spring. And as the pool goes through the water cycle, the water level goes down through spring and late spring and into summer, and and then they dry up by late fall or late summer, early fall. And you can get different animals and also sometimes plants that occur in these different stages of the vernal pool. So that's partly what makes vernal pools so diverse and productive, because you can have both aquatic and terrestrial species in them, or different stages of some of these species that occur in them then. And vernal pools also provide critical habitat for wildlife and for a forest ecosystem function, in that they provide a lot of food, which then provides energy and nutrients for not just the animals that are occurring in the vernal pools with them, but also for that surrounding forest ecosystem. So for example, some of the invertebrates or insects that occur, that breed in vernal pools, and then their adult, their adults go into the surrounding, forest then, or of course, a lot of the amphibians that use vernal pools, their larvae are will turn into adults and then live in the surrounding forest ecosystem, which then provide nutrients for the surrounding forest then as well. Of course, vernal pools as wetlands provide a lot of the same ecosystem services that other wetlands provide. And so like flood control and water storage and infiltration and nutrients. So they're also important for those reasons. And then I wanted to definitely mention about vernal pools having, I think, really important educational and recreational value. When we've been doing these vernal pool training workshops, people just get really excited and engaged at these workshops then, and especially when they see the fairy shrimp and some of these amphibian eggs and larvae and all the different critters that they find in the vernal pools. And because they're small and shallow, they're easier to study or to work in, I think, than some of the larger or deeper wetlands then, or water bodies. And that gives, I think, it provides a unique opportunity for people to experience wetlands, and maybe to help them to learn more about wetlands, and also maybe to get involved with helping to conserve them. But just like other wetlands in Michigan, vernal pools have faced a number of threats then. So we know that we have lost vernal pools, and that they have suffered some degradation and disturbance from a number of different factors, including development, roads, when we fragment wetlands then, or build roads next to vernal pools, or fill them to develop some of these roads then, or other development. And roads also can cause mortality, some of the species that use vernal pools. So for example, some of those amphibians and also reptiles that might move to vernal pools, a lot of times will end up potentially getting hit on roads. Some vernal pools have been converted to permanent ponds, for example, or people might add fish to them. Some vernal pools have had timber harvesting occur around them. Pollution, invasive species can occur around these vernal pools. And then climate change, which we talked a lot about earlier today, and that especially for these shallow wetlands, that if we have changes in precipitation patterns, or increases in temperature, which then can also increase evaporation, and some of the environmental conditions in these vernal pools, that can really change the ecology and the distribution of these vernal pools, and the species that occur in them as well. And then for other threats that vernal pools face is that there's limited awareness about them. So when we've done our training workshops, we've heard a lot from people that they might have seen them, but they didn't really know, what they were called, didn't know that there were all these different species that use them, or how important they are. There's also limited information about vernal pools. So because they're small, because they're seasonal in nature, they can be hard to identify a map on the landscape or even from remote sensing. And we really don't have good information in the state, really about how, where all these vernal pools occur, how many do we have and how they're doing. And then, as mentioned earlier, vernal pools also have limited protection under our current state and federal wetland regulations, which we talked about earlier, and I'll talk a little bit more about later on. But there are some voluntary measures for protecting vernal pools in Michigan. The state's soil and water quality standards and best management practices, and the forest certification standards that the state forests fall under also do contain some measures for protecting vernal pools. So in Michigan, we have been doing some things to try to get a better understanding about our vernal pools that we have in the state, and to figure out, where they are and how can we better manage and protect them. So we have been trying to map and monitor vernal pools since 2011 with a project that was funded by Eagle and EPA. Where we've developed an approach for trying to map potential vernal pools from aerial photo interpretation. We've also been working with Michigan Tech Research Institute to see if we can map potential vernal pools using radar and LiDAR imagery. And then we also have been going out and actually field verifying those potential vernal pools to see if they really are vernal pools on the landscape. And then if they're not, to also keep track of that as well, and also monitor their status and condition. Part of that monitoring is collecting information about the physical and biological characteristics of the vernal pool. So get a better understanding about the different plants and animals that use vernal pools in Michigan, especially those indicator species. So based on some of the vernal pools that we have surveyed so far, about 20% of the vernal pools we have monitored or visited have indicator species documented in them. And then we've also documented over 100 different taxa for invertebrates, a number of our bat species, and also, of course, a number of amphibians and reptiles. And one of the things we've also done is to help us better keep track of the status and distribution of vernal pools in Michigan is to develop a Michigan vernal pool database. And you can actually access and view the vernal pools that we have mapped in the database through the Michigan Vernal Pools Partnership website with the website address and the link shown here. So that will help us. And you can see that, we've made some progress, but there are some huge gaps in the state, and it doesn't mean that there are not vernal pools there. There most likely are vernal pools definitely in other parts of the state, but we just haven't, had the opportunity or the funding yet to really map those vernal pools yet. So one of the things that we have done is to develop a Michigan Vernal Pool Patrol, which is a statewide community science program to help us be able to get more information about vernal pools in Michigan. And it's a program where we've developed a standard protocol, and we train volunteers then to go out and help us verify, map, and collect data about vernal pools then. And then all that information from the volunteers goes into the Michigan Vernal Pool database. We have adults and youth volunteers that are participating in the program, including educators and students in formal and informal education settings. And we do virtual and in-person training workshops in the spring. And all this information that's being collected by the volunteers in the program is really critical for helping us better manage and protect vernal pools and maintain healthy forest ecosystems in Michigan. The other thing I definitely wanted to mention is the Michigan Vernal Pools Partnership. This is a public-private partnership that was launched in 2015, 2016. There are about 30 organizations, public and private organizations, that are part of the partnership. And the mission of the partnership is to promote awareness and protection of vernal pools through conservation, research and mapping, education, outreach, and collaboration and coordination. And so that's the website address there, mivernalpools.com. We have been growing and very active, especially in the last couple of years. So We have annual partnership meetings, which we have one coming up this year in early December. So keep an eye out for that announcement. There's a quarterly e-newsletter that the Michigan Nature Association helps us produce called the Pool Report. We have been producing or starting to produce more education outreach materials, including this really awesome video about vernal pools that Michigan Nature Association has developed. And there's a link there if you want to take a look at it. And then we've also started to, we have some social media opportunities to share information about vernal pools and what the partnership is doing. We have a Facebook page, and we're just starting to get into Instagram and hopefully Twitter soon. So lots of opportunities to learn and find out more about the partnership if you want to find out more or get involved. And so on to protection. So currently, under our state wetland regulations, there are some ways that vernal pools can be regulated then. And so these are the same, regulations that were mentioned earlier for the state wetland regulations under Part 303. So if a vernal pool, for example, is more than 5 acres in size, or part of a wetland that is more than 5 acres in size, it could be regulated. And although we have, we talked about earlier that vernal pools generally are smaller than 5 acres, so this isn't always going to apply, probably in most cases. If there's a threatened or endangered species, either state or federal threatened or endangered species that occurs in a vernal pool, then it can be regulated and protected. If a vernal pool is or part of a rare imperiled wetland, as defined in Part 303, it can be protected. Although, just want to mention that vernal pools currently are not, recognized as its own natural community or as a rare wetland. Then, if a vernal pool or as part has or is part of a wetland that has surface water connection to an inland lake, pond, river, stream, or one of the Great Lakes or Lake St. Clair, it would be regulated or protected. Again, some vernal pools would fall into this category, but there are probably a lot of vernal pools that don't. And then if the vernal pool is partially or entirely located within 500 feet of an inland lake, pond, river, stream, or within 1,000 feet of the Great Lakes or Lake St. Clair. So there are opportunities for vernal pools, if they fall into these categories, then to be protected or regulated under current wetland, state wetland regulations. But a lot of those vernal pools don't fall under those categories. And so that's why I think local protection can help, again, fill that gap and provide more protection for vernal pools than would be protected under our current state wetland regulations then. So as Kate mentioned earlier, you can use the model wetland ordinance, but just make sure to include protection for wetlands that are less than 2 acres in size. And then you would need to make the essentiality determinations. And so that for the essentiality determinations for wetlands that are under 2 acres, you have to meet at least one of the following criteria. So for example, the presence of threatened or endangered plant, fish, or animal species. So for example, the spotted turtle is a state threatened species, so that we talked about earlier, or some of those other herps or other, there's other T&E species as well that could be found in vernal pools. Plants or animals of identified local importance. So that could definitely apply to vernal pools, especially like, for example, fairy shrimp, which only would use, vernal pools and you wouldn't find in any other wetland types. There are some vernal pools that I mentioned that could contribute and provide groundwater recharge or flood and stormwater control, for sure. A lot of them do that. Breeding, feeding, and nesting grounds for wildlife. So we already mentioned that there are a number of amphibians and invertebrates that use vernal pools for breeding, like the wood frog and the spotted salamander and blue spotted salamander. And then, sources of nutrients, talked about all the important with the invertebrates and amphibians that occur in vernal pools, and also because vernal pools are nutritus driven, that that definitely provide nutrients in that food cycle in the vernal pool and for the surrounding forest ecosystem. And as wetlands, they provide some of these other benefits as well that are listed here. And so as you know, as Matt talked about earlier, you know, because vernal pools are wetlands, they should, you know, be able to meet at least one of the essentiality criteria then. So it shouldn't be a hard thing to do. And I just wanted to just quick mention about an example that I know of, just because, you know, I actually live in Meridian Township. And so I know that we familiar with their wetland ordinance and some of the other activities that have been going on in the township. So Meridian Township does have a wetland ordinance. It doesn't specifically mention vernal pools, but the township's wetland ordinance does protect wetlands that are as small as a 1/4 acre in size. So that will capture some, you know, of the vernal pools. Some that are smaller, you know, are going to be smaller and may not capture all of them, but. And then it does include the essentiality criteria in the wetland ordinance. And the ordinance provides a 20-foot buffer around protected vernal pools. So we'll provide some protection in some cases with some of the, especially with some of the amphibians that move a little further. It might not protect all their habitat, but it does provide some protection around these vernal pools then. And the township has done some with collaborating with Michigan Natural Features Inventory and the township's Parks Department and Stewardship Program. We have put on some trainings for vernal pools and done some outreach for vernal pools. MNFI also did some mapping of potential vernal pools in the township. And through their involvement in the Vernal Pool Patrol, they have volunteers that have, you know, that are in the community that are going out and actually following the protocol and collecting data about vernal pools in the township. And that information then can help the township better manage and protect their vernal pools. I know that I sit on the Land Preservation Advisory Board. There definitely has been consideration of the presence of vernal pools when they make some of their land acquisition decisions for nature preserves in the township. And the township is also in the process of updating their climate sustainability plan. And they have proposed, you know, specifically including and mentioning vernal pools in that plan then, and the importance of protecting vernal pools for climate change adaptation or mitigation then. So that's all I have. I hopefully maybe we have some time for questions. But if you want to get a hold of me and want more information about vernal pools, here's my email address. And if you want more information about the Vernal Pools Partnership, this is their website address and also an email address that you can contact the partnership then, or if you want to join the partnership. And there's also information on the Vernal Pool Partnership website about the Michigan Vernal Pool Patrol if you want to learn more about the citizen science program. And I'm done, so.
All right, thanks, Yuman. I think we have a couple of questions for you in the chat, and if anybody else has any other questions, go ahead and put them in the chat or the Q&A. Early on, someone asked, are most vernal pools typically considered forested wetland type? I was hoping you could elaborate on that.
So most vernal pools in Michigan do occur in forested systems. They're not necessarily, and then there are different vernal pool types that are, you know, where in terms of the vegetation that's within a vernal pool, but we are focused on the vernal pools that occur in forested systems or in maybe we're historically forested. There are some, you know, seasonal wetlands that occur in non-forested systems, or for example, like interdunal wetlands then. And so we haven't really figured exactly how we're going to address those, but we mainly have been focusing right now on sort of these the woodland vernal pools.
There was actually, thanks, Yuman. I think there was actually just a couple, you know, thank yous for your work on this project in the chat. I didn't see any other questions, so.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker today is going to be John Rhoda from West Bloomfield, and they are a community that does have ordinances in place. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing about their experiences, and we'll have a little bit of question and answer time with him afterwards as well.
Okay. Hello, I'm John Rhoda. I'm the environmental manager for West Bloomfield Township. I have a master's degree in environmental science with the wetland ecology, woodland ecology emphasis. With that, I am a professional wetland scientist with the Society of Wetland Scientists. I've been working here at the township. I'm on my 24th year. So most of the ordinances, actually all of the ordinances, have already been created and documented and part of the book of ordinances here in the township before I got here. So there's a lot of history with these ordinances starting from back in the 70s. So I will just start from there and flip through these slides and answer any questions thereafter. So you all know many of Michigan's watersheds have been subjected to disturbance since European settlement due to human activities such as draining the land for farming and development, subdivisions, clustered condos, developments, things of that nature, all adds to creating and developing things that wasn't once there. Continuing development does have its continuing effect within these watersheds. However, West Bloomfield Township has a program in place to minimize these negative effects. So where is West Bloomfield Township located? Happens to be located within the southern central portion of Oakland County here in Michigan. And the township itself is actually located within 3 different watersheds. So we're in the headwaters of 3 different watersheds. So I think back in the day, the community understood this. They understood the overdevelopment, even back then, of the surrounding Detroit area, knowing that it's only a matter of time before they start touching portions of West Bloomfield. They knew the importance of being located where they're at, and if they wanted to do their part, what can we protect? How do we go about it? You know, things of that nature. So it was important to them even back then. And well, that was the later 70s, and I'll get to that point in a moment here. Did it freeze up on me? Oh, there we go. So northern headwaters of the Rouge watershed. Whoops, I'm going way too quick. Southwestern section of the Clinton watershed. Sorry, my computer needs to play catch up. There we go. Northeastern section of the Huron watershed. But here's a map showing the 3 different watersheds. So here in the legend, you'll see pink, Clinton, yellow, Huron, light blue is the Rouge. So this is a 36 square mile township of West Bloomfield. However, portions of City of Orchard Lake, Keego Harbor, and Sylvan Lake is somewhat in here as well that we do not regulate for. But for the majority of what you see on this slide, we regulate most of our wetlands, lakes, streams, and floodplain areas. So within these 3 watersheds, West Bloomfield alone, whoops, geez, oh man, there we go. 26 different lakes. Actually, it could probably be bumped up to about 28 lakes. We do have 2 larger pond areas. Once you take into effect what ecologists determine a lake versus a pond, it could be more of 28 lakes, but we stick with the 26 for right now. 25 to 3,000 acres of protected wetlands. That number could be actually increased from there if you actually did a full inventory, ground truth, and then get those numbers of square footages and acreage. But that's what we go with for now, including a 25-foot environmental feature setback to all boundaries of wetland, lake, and stream areas. So there are 7 environmental and also engineering ordinances that have been passed in the township to protect these watersheds and their important functions. We have a wetlands ordinance that was created in 1979. And I'll get a little bit into these ordinances in a second. So with the wetlands ordinance, sorry, my wheel, I'm spinning my wheel here and it keeps doing this. Sorry. So with our wetlands ordinance, we protect everything you plan on propose to do, or maybe you didn't propose it, but we caught you doing it. Those are always fun. In any of our canals, lakes, streams, wetlands, of course. So if you're proposing to do something within these areas, we require permitting, depending on the size and connection to anything that Eagle regulates for. We make sure that Eagle is getting notified one way or another, or they're applying for their permits with Eagle as well. That's part of state law for our local enforcing agency. To have a program like this, we have to be making sure that Eagle is notified of all permitting that they're required to be notified by. So with that, we also have an environmental feature setback ordinance. This is not a wetlands ordinance. So our wetlands ordinance is one separate chapter altogether. The environmental feature setback ordinance is a zoning ordinance. However, we regulate it through our wetland permitting since it deals with creating a protection of buffer to our wetlands. So with that, I can answer questions probably later. I don't want to take up too much time talking about each specific ordinance and all the nuances of it. But to get into the environmental feature setback to these areas, that requires a permit as well. And then obviously there's a whole slew of requirements that you need to check out with your proposal if you want to get into those areas, and how are you going to mitigate for those impacts. We also have a grading, soil erosion, and sedimentation control ordinance and program. So through wetland permitting and environmental feature setback permitting, eventually, depending on the size of your project, you may need topographical surveys showing everything: boundary lines, wetland boundary lines, 25-foot setback lines, 100-year floodplain lines. We need to see all that because with a new home, or a home could be existing, you could have an elaborate landscaping that the homeowner wishes to do. And then with our commercial developments too, this all goes into that review as well. So with obtaining a specific grading soil erosion control permit ordinance for your property, it might overlap or be part of a package deal with a wetlands permit as well. And these plans need to coordinate with those plans to make sure that everyone's up and up with their project, and we're going through the proper protection, and what was permitted to be installed or constructed can go forth with specific restoration or mitigation with those plans within these wetland areas, or you're creating wetland areas that wasn't a wetland before. So again, I don't want to get too off the track here of what we're talking about, but I'd be more than happy to answer questions later. We also have stormwater management ordinance. So that goes into the civil infrastructure of sedimentation, stormwater control with developments. So this has a lot to do with mostly commercial developments, and what are you building and what's that going to require to store water on your site before it does go downstream to protected streams, wetlands, that sort of thing. We also have a fertilizing ordinance that contractors, professional companies are supposed to adhere to. Coal tar ordinance, I just threw that on there, but it's still important, but not so much wetland science, but we do have that. And we also have a woodlands ordinance. So that can go hand in hand with our wetlands ordinance as well. So that's a zoning ordinance also, and that goes by a mapped woodland, and there's certain criteria that go into a regulated woodland of a certain tree stand and basal density and size and things of that nature. But definitely can overlap, as we already heard. Vernal pools, wetlands can be within these woodland areas. Well, if you want to go into the woodland area with your proposal and go by the rules and procedures of the woodland ordinance, your wetland and environmental feature setback ordinance has to be thought of as well when, well, developers mostly, but you know, this could and does hinder private property owners as well with these. So if you didn't pick up on this by now, yes, these ordinances regulate your private property as well. So it might be your property, however, Township of West Bloomfield can regulate wetlands, environmental feature setback, regulated woodlands on your property. So when someone comes in and they realize for the first time they have a wetland behind their house. They don't find out until they come in because they wanted to put an in-ground swimming pool where that wetland is or something like that. So we get into delightful, fun conversations quite a bit here at work. So our wetlands ordinance, all the township rivers, lakes, streams, floodplain, and wetlands are protected by this local ordinance. Most activities are strictly prohibited in all wetlands, such as vegetation disturbance, altering of a wetland, filling or cutting into the wetland, shoreline control, and application of fertilizers, just to name a few, which I already did. In most cases, site-specific conditions must be reviewed by the Township Environmental Commission. So we have a commission here, Planning Commission, Zoning Commission, Township Board, Zoning Board of Appeals. We also have an Environmental Commission here. At one point in time, it was actually a Wetland Review Board and a Woodland Review Board. They combined the two, making them the Environmental Commission. That is the commission that I am the liaison, catalyst, spokesman to, I guess. So with all of our permit requests, I'm the one that reviews your files, make sure that it's as complete as possible, and then schedule you for a night in front of the Environmental Commission to ask your request and go through that process to see if you can get a permit through the Environmental Commission here. So wetland permit requirements, I am not going to list everything our ordinance states. If anyone would like to look through our ordinance at their leisure, go for it. I can answer any questions maybe when you go through our ordinances, but I named just a few here. So any work activities, disturbances within that wetland, lake, canal, stream, and the 100-year floodplain, which is also regulated or watched over by FEMA. Those areas require a township permit, possibly Eagle permit as well, as we know. All fill-in structure requests within those areas will require a mitigation proposal. So a lot of people mistake, I don't want to go too far off, but mitigation, restoration. Mitigation is a give back for what you're impacting, not restoring an area of what you disturbed. There's a big difference there. A lot of people use those words loosely, and I try to iron that out. Well, they're two different words here and two different meanings, two different perspectives, but our ordinance makes sure that you want to impact an area, you're going to propose mitigation one way or another. And that might be engineering plans, how you're going to regrade the site out to create more wetland area, or it may just be you're in the area. What is not regulated, you're going to add a native landscaping plan, and now we're going to regulate that from here on out. So it all depends on what your proposal is. All wetland fill structures requests require a mitigation proposal on a 2-to-1 mitigation ratio. If I'm filling in 1,000 square feet of wetland, where else are you going to give back 2,000 square feet of wetland? With engineering plans, cross sections, zonation, planning plans, making sure things are obligate versus facultative wetland plants, shrubs, trees, what have you, forbs. All 100-year floodplain fill requests require a mitigation proposal on a 1-to-1 mitigation ratio. Say you're not in the wetland or the setback, but you're in floodplain. Like up in Cass Lake, we have a lot of floodplain areas. You want to fill in 1,000 square feet and it's about going to be, I don't know, 100 cubic yards, say. Where else on your property are you going to grade down your property to compensate for that void now? You're going to fill the bathtub. Where are you going to create more bathtub in? And you have to reflect that all on detailed engineering plans through a permitting process as well. So these type of requests will require detailed engineering plans, stamped and signed, professional civil engineering engineer or a licensed surveyor. Can't be a landscape design plan stamped by a landscape designer. It's specific to these folks here that we're looking for detailed restoration plan. Well, the restoration plan could be landscape, sorry. But your main engineering plans, we have specifics on that. Straight native species. So we're making sure that any restoration or mitigation plans, if they are going to require the protection and the proper vegetation, we are reviewing for the straight native species, the genus names and everything, not anything hybrid and adventive cultivars, that sort of thing. Wetland determination may be required first, conducted by the township, myself, or a private consultant, and then I verify their work before survey work is to begin. This, I'm going to go through this very quickly. This is taken from our website. We do have an actual wetland environmental mitigation manual that we set up 5-6 years ago through our consultant at that time. It basically runs through native species, just the popular stuff that you may have an easier time finding at nurseries. You can't just go to Home Depot for this stuff, folks. You usually have to know know people in the biz, or you're a landscaper and you have an account of where to find this stuff at. So that gets a little sticky sometimes when you're dealing with just a homeowner versus an actual contractor that can find these specialized plants. Just more different seed mixes I wanted to show you guys. So wetland edge, emergent wetland, forested, dry wetland, forested wetland, dry woodland, so you can read for yourself there. And then all of those species, for the most part, is what we're hoping for when you need to get a wetland seed mix or a wetland edge seed mix. The majority of this plethora of species is in that mix. So once a homeowner understands how much an ounce of this stuff is, I get to hear about that fun too. But anyway, we move on. I know this has nothing to do, this is just part of our regulation, so I'm going to do this really quickly. Here's a restoration.
John, this is
Yes?
Amy. I think this is about when you wanted to switch over to Q&A.
Okay. I pretty much said what I needed to say, I guess, because those are...
Oh, do you want to cover the natural feature, the environmental feature setback ordinances, and then maybe switch to Q&A?
Sure.
Okay.
So 25-foot natural area that's preserved between upland areas and water resources such as wetlands. That's the environmental feature setback. Buffer provides an important zone of natural vegetation that acts as a filter for pollutants before they enter the water from upland sources. Setback area provides crucial breeding and hiding habitat for wildlife and should be left in its natural state in order to provide the most benefits. In most cases, site-specific conditions must be reviewed by the Environmental Commission, which I've already mentioned. A lot of this stuff, sorry guys, a lot of this stuff I think I've already mentioned, quite honestly. So I don't want to take too much of the seminar's time on this, but I think I pretty much hit all these bullet points. I'll be able to answer any questions this time.
Great, thanks, John.
Sure. Sorry about all that.
No, that was great.
great.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
We do have some questions for you, John. I think in general, we have some questions, and then there have been some additional questions put in the chat. So
Sure.
can you respond a little bit? How do having these local environmental ordinances benefit the community at West Bloomfield?
Well, it benefits the community altogether, because with these ordinances in place and what we're trying to protect, it does give a higher value of life to the community where you want to live, where you want to raise your family, things of that nature. As I said previously, before development got the way it was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, this community already saw that happening. They wanted to prevent these areas being filled in and push water downstream, point A to point B, as quick as you possibly can, and let another community deal with that water, or deal with that erosion, or deal with that movement of wildlife habitat out of your area. They wanted to keep that here in this community because of all of its beauty, the lakes and the streams and the wetland areas. So with that, they get to benefit their lake environments even that much better. A lot of these wetland areas that we're protecting filter stormwater, sediments, pollutants, filter more nutrients, fertilizers. So I'd imagine if we didn't have a lot of these ordinances in check, a lot of these lake areas could be witnessing a lot more problematic situations, such as algae blooms and heating up of water, fish kills. List goes on and on.
Yeah, thank you. What are some of the challenges that the township has faced with these ordinances, and how have they addressed them?
The challenges mostly would be perspective would be probably the best way to say that. Perspective and having a petitioner understand exactly what's being asked of them to even apply for one of our permits. Not everyone has the finances available to put site plans together properly, to even to identify things properly on a site plan. Our ordinances are created like there's no major or minor permit here. It's there is kind of, but I don't want to get off on that topic. But what a developer can afford to have proper site plans drawn up, which is really the original ordinances and how they were created, versus just a homeowner that may want to trim some cattails or something like that. The ordinance book is pretty specific on what you need to apply for. So there is a delicate dance between what the request is and what the ordinance says, and then what we're really going to accept to hear a case. So that would be pretty much the biggest challenge, would just be proper plan development, site plan development to hear a case properly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. How do you staff and fund administration of these ordinances, including the use of environmental consultants?
We have positions created here at the township. So as far as regulation of these ordinances, there are certain folks here that actually are the teeth, are the regulation behind it, the enforcement, I being one of them, as well as Michelle Gartland, who is my right-hand lady that helps me with a lot of this enforcement. I believe she's part of the participants today in this seminar. We also have a code enforcement team that helps us with ticket writing, getting those tickets over to court to set up people's court dates, because if you're not going to comply with our ordinances, then we need to hear your case in court. And then so we have township attorneys and everything else that get involved with that. So consulting, our consultants that are part of environmental commission, the petitioner's paying for that. You set up an escrow account to pay their time during your meeting to weigh in on your request. The petitioner funds their own consultants and attorneys and engineers, things of that nature. There is no other really funding about it, other than if you want to come in for a permit request, the petitioner is usually the one that's going to be paying for the permit and consulting fees on the township side of things.
Okay. And what advice do you have on implementation of these ordinances after having many years of experience?
It is so difficult to cover everything in every situation. And I've been here, I'm on my 24th year now. So we have a wetland ordinance 1979. The environmental feature setback came into effect in 1994. Our woodlands ordinance in 1989. Through all of it, I still have to go back to those ordinances and reread them, depending on what is the situation, what is the issue, what was violated, what happened here, that type of thing. There's a lot of times where you have to go back to the ordinance, reread it again, different subsections of the ordinance. And then there's always those, I don't think I've ever dealt with this scenario before. It's not in the ordinance, so how are we going to go about this? So talk to my supervisor, my director, and we'll have to get our township attorney involved and go to that specific section of the ordinance and see if we can revise the ordinance to be either, it could be anything, more protection or easier for us to handle a permit or something of that nature. So I don't know if I really answered it.
No, I appreciate that. I think a lot of our listeners have questions about sort of the nuts and bolts, like when you're doing this, how does it go? Yeah. We have a couple other specific questions about West Bloomfield. One of them is, do you regulate man-made lakes or constructed lakes or water bodies? And does this include cutting vegetation, cutting wetland plants along man-made water bodies?
If the lake is known to be man-made, and it's been on all maps, and it's on our wetlands map, and Oakland County even has record and the state has record that that's an actual lake, then our ordinances are going to treat that as a lake and its littoral wetland areas to it or anything that's fed into it, possibly up to a point. Most of our man-made depressional bodies of water that are man-made usually are detention basins, or they're either detention or retention basins for subdivisions, which we do not regulate as wetlands. They can take on wetland characteristics. I could determine it a wetland based on wetland characteristics, but if we know it's an engineered basin, we let our stormwater management ordinance handle what it is that you want to do to that basin rather than have wetland regulations on it. I believe all of our lakes are all natural lakes. Other than that, they could have been created as a pond at one point in time, and then to lure tourists up in this mom and pop community of West Bloomfield back in the day, they called them lakes. So they went from something that could be West Bloomfield Pond and they named it lake to make it more flashy. But something I read not too long ago, and I thought that was actually interesting. Very interesting.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Does West Bloomfield have mitigation banks?
No, we don't have any mitigation banks. So you need to mitigate on your property. So your request is going to require mitigation. I hope you have upland room on your property to recreate wetland area. We don't go offsite with mitigation, which is unlike the state. I know, I understand, but not here in our township. You're either going to, hopefully you have enough room to mitigate on your property, or if you're limited, come up with as much as you possibly can come up with to naturalize your property and see if our environmental commission will go for it. That's about the best way I can say that. Okay. Yeah.
And I think the last question we have for you is, what percentage of proposals get approved or denied by the environmental committee?
That's a good question. Out of a given year, maybe 90% approved, 10% denied, or that out of that 10% come back to see the environmental commission with more of what the commission was wanting to see to get them an approval, if that makes sense. Or you'll get an approval with a shopping list full of conditions that I have to make sure that the developer or homeowner does. So they might not like your plan, but what was discussed at the meeting with special conditions, they'll approve your plan, but they're going to approve your plan with 20 more conditions to it. You must do this, you must do that, you must do this, you must do that on it. So that's why I say such a high approval on that. So a lot of it is approval with a lot of conditions to them.
Yeah. We did get one more question. Are there 5 to 10 year monitoring requirements for constructed wetlands? I think constructed and mitigation wetlands.
Right, for the state there would be. For us, it's only 2 years. Your wetland permit's only good for 2 years. I'm monitoring through that up until when I can close you out of your permit. So if everything's complied with, the petitioner did, or the petitioner did everything they were supposed to do, and it's thriving and doing well, and your permit expires next month, and it's month 22 or something like that, I'm going to close you out. I'm not coming back to your site again. What was supposed to be done with this permit was done. I monitor it for the length that I can monitor it for, and then hope you don't have to come in. I hope you leave it alone and take care of it. Like, leave it alone basically is taking care of it, but hopefully they don't disturb it at all. Chances are we see this quite a bit, where we heard a case, say 15 years ago. I closed the permit out, and last week they wanted to put in an in-ground pool or deck or something like that. I go to the site and went, what happened to all this vegetation? So you can see how how fun that can get when they came in for a request of a deck or something like that, or a pool, and they didn't get that. They got what they didn't think they were going to get, and that's going to be a notice of violation that they have to rectify why all the wetland vegetation has been removed and why is it a yard now. So that's just one scenario.
All right.
Mhm.
Thanks so much, John. I think you've answered all the questions. I think we all really appreciated your presentation and insight into West Bloomfield's ordinances.
Sure, no problem. My pleasure. There's so much to it. I just wish that, you know, I got to give the gab. I know that. And there's so much to this that gets really involved. But if anyone wants to reach out to me, and give me a call here at the township or my my email address. You can find me on the website, township website, and then we can go from there. But all of our ordinances are online as well. But that's it. That's all I have to say.
All right. Thanks so much.
Sure.
We're going to take a short break here, everyone, and we'll be back at 2:10 for Jennifer McKay from Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council. They were instrumental in developing some of the guidebooks that we have been referencing in our presentation. So I hope to see you all back here for her presentation at 2:10. Thanks so much.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, you can.
All right, perfect. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I am the last presenter, so hopefully I will be entertaining enough to keep your interest. But my name is Jennifer McKay, and I am the Policy Director for Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the local protection case studies that we've had, both the successes and the current priorities that we are working on now. So those of you that are not familiar with the Watershed Council, we're a nonprofit membership-based organization with more than 40 years of history protecting and improving water resources in northern Michigan. We protect, restore, and enhance our lakes, streams, wetlands, and groundwater through respected advocacy, innovative education, technically sound water quality monitoring, thorough research and restoration actions. We also achieve our mission by empowering others, and we believe in the capacity to make a difference. We work locally in the watershed of Antrim, Charlevoix, and Emmett counties, sorry for the dog, as well as regionally and throughout the Great Lakes Basin. So we currently have 11 staff members, but we also have hundreds of volunteers that work tirelessly to achieve our mission. So since 1979, the Watershed Council has been a voice for the water resources in northern Michigan. And for all their beauty and grandeur, our lakes, rivers, and wetlands cannot speak for themselves. And so they need an advocate on behalf of themselves. And the advocate in northern Michigan has been Tip of the Mitt Watershed Council. We have many programs to fulfill this role as the advocate, including working closely with local units of government to improve protections as a role for protecting water resources. And over the years, we have provided many tools and have seen numerous successes. So today I'm going to share with you just a few of the success stories that we have seen. So the first is the Charlevoix County Stormwater Ordinance. So prior to 2006, Charlevoix County had a stormwater ordinance within the county. However, a letter was written by the Chief Deputy Attorney General in May of that year that was written to a prosecuting attorney of Grand Traverse County that was working on a project in wetlands. The letter indicated that counties were actually not authorized to adopt an ordinance to regulate stormwater, regulating the flooding that does not cause soil erosion and sedimentation, because it could interfere with the local affairs of cities, villages, and townships. And so cities, villages, and townships, who unlike counties, have broad authority to adopt ordinances related to the areas of local concerns, such as flooding. As a result, the stormwater ordinance in Charlevoix County, as well as many other areas such as Grand Traverse County and others, were repealed. So subsequently, the Watershed Council had to get to work. We had multiple meetings with every single municipality within Charlevoix County, and we worked to encourage them to pass an identical ordinance. The townships also entered into intergovernmental agreements with Charlevoix County to administer and enforce the ordinance for them. That effort itself took 6 years. In addition to that, it took another 7 years after that to get all of the 3 cities within Charlevoix County to enact the identical stormwater ordinance. And the reason why it took so long is because those cities wanted to add specific language to address their needs as urban areas, which is different than the ordinances that the rural townships had adopted. However, from 2006 to 2019, again, very long effort on behalf of our part and our partners, we now have every township, village, and city within Charlevoix County, except for one township that does not have surface water features, that has adopted the stormwater ordinance that is now enforced by Charlevoix County Soil Erosion and Sedimentation Control Officer. So it's a huge success. We also worked on an Emmett County Phragmites project, and I'm sure most people are aware of what Phragmites are. It's a perennial wetland grass that grows up to 15 feet in height. And while Phragmites are in fact native to Michigan, there's an invasive non-native variety of Phragmites that is widespread and threatens the ecological health of wetlands in the Great Lakes coastal shoreline. And invasive Phragmites creates tall, dense stands which degrade wetlands and coastal areas by crowding out the native plants and animals. It blocks shorelines view. It reduces access for swimming, fishing, and hunting. And it can actually create fire hazards from the dry plant material. So in an effort to stop the spread and reduce the amount of Phragmites on our northern Michigan coastlines, we worked with Emmett County, property owners, and other stakeholders in the area. So in June of 2010, the Emmett County Board of Commissioners actually passed what is known as the Phragmites Control Ordinance. So it was a 1-year pilot implementation program that was designed by the Watershed Council. The pilot included a voluntary participation program. The concept was essentially to educate the public about Phragmites and give people the chance to participate in treatment of Phragmites for 1 year at no cost to them, demonstrating a creative approach to public policy. And the reason why we were able to offer the 1 year no cost is because we had obtained a grant from MDNRE, as it was known at that time, which is now Eagle. But it was offering funding to treat Phragmites at no cost to property owners or local governments. So what we did was we sent letters out to explain the problem. We asked property owners for permission to treat the invasive Phragmites on their land. And we also offered the ability for any individual who wanted to opt out of the program and deny permission. Our survey of Emmett County's Lake Michigan shoreline showed 291 invasive stands of Phragmites, which translated to 231 individual permission slips that we needed for treatment. Out of that, we only received 14 denials for permission for treatment. So it was a great success. And I cannot, still to this day, say how much we appreciate the hard work of our project partners to make sure we got all of that permission. Now, each year, the Watershed Council partners with the Emmett County Board of Commissioners to secure the permit needed for treatment, which is what is called a certificate of coverage, so that individuals don't have to apply for a permit on their own. Additionally, every 2 years, we do a new comprehensive shoreline survey looking for new Phragmites growth or any area that we might have missed during treatment from the previous year, while at the same time making owners aware of the threat to their shoreline from Phragmites. Unfortunately, at this point in time, individuals on the shoreline are now responsible to pay for their own treatment because we no longer have the grant opportunity. Another initiative we undertook was called the GAPS analysis. And this was to provide local government officials with a comprehensive picture of the water protections in place at county and township levels. It also included our recommended local approaches to protect waters, as well as what we would suggest to be improved to better protect water resources. So this was done across our entire service area and included Antrim, Charlevoix, Emmett, and Sheboygan counties, as well as every jurisdiction within each county. The project was done with an underlying assumption that there are specific critical elements that are considered vital to address if a local government wants to create strong protections for local water resources. So there's critical elements where master plan components, basic zoning components, shorelines, impervious surfaces and stormwater management, soil erosion and sediment control, sewers and septics, wetlands, groundwater and wellhead protection, as well as floodplain, steep slopes, and critical dunes. So for all of these, there was an evaluation checklist along with a scoring and ranking system. And the ranking system was essentially strong, adequate, weak, or missing. And so if it was strong, it meant that the ordinance was deemed to be more protective or better than most ordinances in the state. If it was adequate, it was on par with other ordinances in the state. If it was weak, obviously it was deemed weaker than similar ordinances in the state. And if it was missing, it was not included in the jurisdiction's ordinance. We shared all of this information with all of the jurisdictions. And I will say we are currently have grants to review the GAPS analyses in some of our watersheds to compare whether ordinances have been modified, added, dropped since the completion of the original analysis. And we're using this gaps analysis to help identify priorities and work to promote and implement ordinances with the potential to have the greatest impact on water resources protection. Another endeavor we've taken on was called Enacting Shoreline Zoning Protections Around Lake Charlevoix. This is actually a 3-year project aimed at protecting the water quality of Lake Charlevoix through the adoption of shoreline protection standards in the 10 jurisdictions surrounding the lake. So we contracted with the Land Information Access Association, also known as LIA, which is a nonprofit community services organization based in Traverse City. And so the project team essentially worked with local planning and zoning officials to develop and implement new zoning standards for waterfront properties around the lake. So we took a number of steps. So the first step was convening a steering committee comprised primarily of zoning administrators representing each of the 10 jurisdictions. We also developed a project website, which is at the bottom of the screen. It's lakecharlevoixprotection.org, which still exists today, and tracks the existing zoning ordinances for each jurisdiction as they relate to water quality. The website also served as a resource for the communities to learn more about how they can improve water quality protection through their local ordinances. So the next step was to review the findings and recommendations from previous shoreline protection efforts, and to use those findings to guide the creation of the shoreline protection recommendations found in the report we developed under this effort. Step 3 was working under the guidance of the steering committee, which again was a bunch of zoning administrators. Leah reviewed the contents of each of the 10 zoning ordinances as they pertain to the whole host of different zoning standards that protect water quality. Using the review of existing ordinances as the starting point, the project team worked with the steering committee to develop a list of 10 best practices that informed recommendations for each community. Step 4 along the way, education was a huge component of the project. Presentations were made to the public and local officials throughout the duration. Leah presented through Charlevoix County's Planner Forum, which the Watershed Council hosts every year, at least we did until COVID, to educate local communities about the importance of water quality protection. They provided an overview of the project, provided updates, and got feedback on how to best connect local communities and make the information meaningful and implementable. Leah also presented directly in front of all of the 10 planning commissions at their monthly meetings to review recommended changes to the zoning ordinances and receive feedback from the commissions on which ordinance language would be most appropriate for the community to adopt. And the last step was based upon the feedback. The project team drafted a series of recommended edits tailored to each individual jurisdiction's ordinance. And those proposed edits were made to be easily inserted into existing ordinances and were based upon, again, the feedback from the Planning Commission as to what types of ordinance amendments would be most realistic to implement, both politically and practicably. And so I won't necessarily go through each of these recommendations, but you can see from the list, we covered setbacks, we covered maximum impervious surface lot coverage. We recommended that zoning ordinances not be approved until all permits were obtained from state, federal, and county, including the health departments. We recommended formal site plan reviews for all waterfront projects, limits on docks and the number of boats. It addressed funneling. It required a 50-foot setback. There were also specific provisions for the setback area with respect to use of fertilizers and requirements for trees and woody plants to be planted, limitations on viewing platforms and pathways, and prohibition of beach sanding. And when I say we recommended this, I want to emphasize that this was not a recommendation on behalf of Tippecanoe Watershed Council or LEA. This is actually recommendations that were made by the Planning Commission and the zoners. So since 2016, many of these recommendations have actually been implemented by the various jurisdictions. I will mention this during the current priorities when I get to that, but we're revisiting this effort. And that has allowed the Watershed Council to actually review the ordinances and take stock of which recommendations have been implemented. And it's pleasing to see how many of these ordinances have been implemented. So the next one, as everyone knows, too far. As everyone knows, we had extremely high water levels in 2019 and 2020. And during that time, the Watershed Council felt it was vital to not only work with the public, but local municipalities to make more informed and comprehensive long-term decisions by clarifying current thinking on how Great Lakes water levels are projected to change and describing an approach for incorporating variations in future water levels in decision making. So a couple of the things we did, we created a site plan review checklist that can be used by local governments to assess the impacts of climate change and fluctuating water levels into the site plan review process. We improved our master plan checklist, which is intended to ensure that master plans include critical freshwater resource protections. So we updated that document to include climate change impact questions. Again, as master planning by local governments must include steps to ensure services and community assets are resilient to extreme weather events and expected services from climate change. And finally, we updated our inland lake buffer zone model ordinance to improve shoreline management that can provide resiliency in the face of climate change. In addition, by coordinating with LEA, again, we were not only able to provide those simple ordinances and promote those ordinances and master planning guidance, we are also able to have LEA complete what is called a community sustainable assessments for many of our coastal municipalities. And so through these assessments, LEA was able to evaluate various benchmarks related to coastal sustainability, such as data gathering, mapping, zoning regulation, house siting, critical facilities and infrastructure, and hazard planning. And so this assessment in particular looks for gaps in communities' overall sustainability by identifying what is working well, what is present but needs improvement, what is missing, what is unclear. And then once each benchmark has been categorized, the community can begin to plan for a more resilient future by addressing the best practices that would benefit the local economy, social opportunities, environment, and the coastline. And then in addition, from the assessments, the Watershed Council also developed recommendations for each community to focus what would result in the most water quality protections. So we met with each community to review and discuss the LEA assessments as well as our individual recommendations. So now I'm going to change the focus a little bit, and I'm going to discuss our current priorities and projects that are underway as we speak. And the first one is septic systems. So Michigan, has 1.3, 1.4 million on-site septic systems, and 35% of our residents rely on septic systems. Each of those systems generate an average of 300, 400 gallons of sewage daily, which means that on-site systems in Michigan must treat and dispose of more than 455 million gallons of wastewater each day. And in Northern Michigan, which is where I'm based, many of us rely on septic systems for wastewater treatment. And Michigan currently is the only state in the nation without uniform standards for how septic systems are designed, built, installed, and maintained. So public health officials in Michigan believe reported septic system failures represent only a fraction of the total number of failures statewide, and many go undetected or remain unreported for years. A 2015 study conducted by Michigan State University used microbial source tracking tools to show that pollution arising from septic system discharges is more serious than we previously realized. Results suggest that human fecal contamination is affecting 100% of the 64 studied river systems in Michigan's Lower Peninsula. And it was already mentioned that, a failing or improperly maintained septic system introduces nutrients, bacteria, viruses, pharmaceuticals, and other pollutants to our lakes, streams, wetlands, and groundwater. And so in the absence of a statewide code, Michigan has local septic codes that can be created by the local district health departments in conjunction with township and county governments. And as such, the local government is in the best position for taking action to address local concerns about septic system performance. But currently, only 11 out of our 83 counties in Michigan have a requirement for septic inspections, and those are during the transfer of sale or property. So the Watershed Council, in partnership with a septic subcommittee that we've developed, has identified and is promoting policy advantages to septic regulation for local governments to consider. Each option obviously has its own advantages, disadvantages, pros and cons. So we're reaching out to local governments, presenting each of these policy options and explaining the various pros and cons and providing sample ordinances. So as far as maintaining the status quo, this option obviously requires no changes in current oversight or policy processes. Education outreach, excuse me, can be done for very little cost. Some improvement may occur after system failures are brought to the attention of the health department and are replaced. And as older homes and cottages are raised and replaced with year-round homes, but the pace upon which it would be done is likely unacceptable because many older systems are going to go uninspected and unmaintained and basically fail, resulting in public health and environmental problems. Time of transfer ordinances were already mentioned. So this ensures that septic systems are inspected at the time when a lot is sold, informing the buyer of the state of the system and requirements for proper maintenance moving forward. If the system is found to be leaking or improperly operating or near the end of its effective life, then a plan for remediation is formally required and a follow-up inspection is done to ensure compliance. These inspections are normally conducted by the health department, but contractors can also be designated to do inspections. Another option is a mandatory pumping ordinance, which is designed to prevent failures by making sure that everyone pumps out their septic system within a specified time frame and shows proof of doing so. There is software systems that could help jurisdictions organize and keep track of this option. Another option is mandatory inspection ordinances, in which inspections are regularly conducted or overseen by the health department within a specified time period. The homeowner is only required to do whatever is appropriate for their specific system. The cost of the program can be offset by fees. And again, reliable software programs exist to help a jurisdiction organize and keep track of the process. Short-term rentals is a pretty hot topic these days. And septic systems can be regulated through short-term rentals. This can be an important first step as many of the rentals are on lakes and streams. And in addition, many homes are rented are not done so in compliance with the health code. For example, many systems are constructed based upon the capacity of the home or the number of bedrooms. However, the rentals often double, if not triple, the occupancy, putting intense stress on the septic system. So there's a variety of options for short-term rentals. It could require pumping on a regular basis, such as every 3 years. It could require certification by the health department that the septic system meets code, or it could limit the occupancy. And the last option is sewers. And many communities are now looking at option for sewer systems. So septic systems that are properly planned, designed, sited, installed, operated, and maintained provide excellent wastewater treatment. But when they're sited in densities that exceed treatment capacity of regional soils and systems, or they're poorly designed and properly installed, not operated or maintained properly, then we see problems. And some areas have decided that due to developments, high development or lot sizes, etc., it's not possible for current septic systems to meet code. And they subsequently pursue sewer systems. The Watershed Council developed 4 publications recently to share information with not only landowners, but realtors, local officials, to educate on proper septic maintenance and advocate for local septic ordinances. We also have a presentation that has been developed by our septic subcommittee to share with planning commissions, townships, villages, county boards, and we're still continuing that effort. I previously spoke about the success of our enacting shoreline zoning protection around Lake Charlevoix. And we are again working on similar endeavors. So, we undertook that effort in 2016, but now we've had recent high water levels, ongoing development pressure. There's been an increase in shoreline hardening practices and multiple challenges, the commitment to maintaining a functional shoreline protection zone. And so as a result, the Lake Charlevoix Association, in collaboration with Tip of the Mint Watershed Council and LEA, are working to reinvigorate the commitment local governments previously made to the protection of Lake Charlevoix. We are once again meeting with all 10 jurisdictions around Lake Charlevoix for the purpose of sharing insight from our recent experiences with high water levels, and to obtain feedback on how they envision protecting and preserving Lake Charlevoix for the future. So we intend to use that feedback to, 1, identify core values and desired outcomes, and 2, priority activities and actions that should be taken to realize those values and outcomes. So our intent is really to realign the communities around the lake to provide an updated and better informed vision and set of strategies for protecting and preserving the lake. And use it as a basis to revive the commitment to maintaining shoreline protection through local zone ordinances. So this is the overall process going back all the way to 2013, but we're in the 2022 process, and we've currently met with 8 out of 10 of the jurisdictions. And there are definitely themes that we're seeing with respect to education, enforcement, problems with Eagle and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on permits, an interest in coordination for ordinances and review of site plans. And we're taking in all of this information received, and we'll meet with the township again to, 1, ensure we heard everything correctly, and then 2, discuss potential recommendations, suggestions. And then the future, we're going to develop a final report and could work towards implementation. Site reviews. So the Watershed Council often does site reviews on our own, but we also recently signed an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, with Hayes Township. They have a shoreline protection subcommittee to review waterfront development proposals, and the Watershed Council has agreed to participate in that process, to review the proposals in an advisory condition. We're going to look at, its compliance with the ordinance, its potential impacts upon the water resources, our recommendation for approval or denial, and an exploration of feasible and prudent alternatives. So this is just another way that local governments can help you utilize local organizations. And I didn't quite do that right, came off the screen. But and my last thing is the tips. So after spending more than 17 years in this role and working with multiple units of local government to improve protections, here's some of my basic recommendations. Don't reinvent the wheel. There are many existing model ordinances out there that can be used. Eagle has them. The Watershed Council has them. Huron River Watershed Council has them. Michigan Township Association has them. Use them, modify them as needed for your municipality. just always make sure you have an attorney review them to ensure that they're appropriate for your use and will hold up in a code of law. Know that assistance is available. There are many of it entities that want to help, such as the Watershed Council, and take advantage of those organizations that are willing to do the work and seek grant funding. It can save you time, it can save you resources. And many of these organizations have specific knowledge that commissioners and planners might not have. In addition, organizations can also help build community support, which you often need to get ordinances passed. Know that you're not alone. Most likely you have nearby jurisdictions that are facing the same or similar issues. And so talk to each other, rely on each other, and share resources. The perfect example I have is Lake Charlevoix that I spoke on. You know, we have all the townships now working on intergovernmental agreements to have the county implement and enforce the stormwater ordinance. Likewise, you know, we're working on the effort to have all the jurisdictions collaborate and have similar ordinances for shoreline protection. And again, when provided with recommendations, follow through with them. You know, someone else did the analysis to determine what the greatest threats are and how to address them, and don't try and just use that data. And then again, the last thing I will say is, you know, the Watershed Council reviews all individual permit applications to determine if the project proposed meets the requirements in federal or state law. And we comment on all of those. And local units of government should receive copies of all of those permit applications. And that is your opportunity to make a difference. And so don't disregard those. If it's against your ordinance or if it's something that does not fit within your zoning, comment to Eagle and/or U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And with that, I will stop and take questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer. We do have several questions in the Q&A for you. The first question is, who were the grants that you mentioned sponsored by, and how do you find these grants?
So I mentioned a lot of projects.
I think that question came in early on in one of the, I think it was maybe during the Phragmites one, and maybe the one right before that. So.
Okay, so Phragmites grant was from the state of Michigan. Let me pull up my PowerPoint to see exactly what products, because I'll go through it.
Was it through the DNR and Eagle AIS grants? I seem to recall that.
Yes. So that was through an AIS grant, the DNR AIS grant.
Did you guys use CZM funding for any of those?
The enacting shoreline zoning protection was through 319 grants through Eagle as well. The climate resiliency and adapting to water levels grant was a local community foundation that funded that work. Septic system failures, that is a local foundation and a private individual that wishes to remain anonymous. And the Lake Charlevoix visioning work that we're continuing on the 319 grant is actually funded by the Lake Charlevoix Association and a local community foundation.
Great.
So they're between local donors, community foundations, state grants, they're kind of all over.
All right, the next question is, do you ever look at environmental response to your actions, like before and after implementation? And if so, can you say how effective your actions have been?
Well, so yeah, that's exactly where we're, you know, for example, the Lake Charlevoix enacting local zoning protections, we're actually going back to it right now. And we're taking a look at exactly what was implemented versus what was not. Likewise, with the gaps analysis, we're actually through, again, 319 funding from EAGLE, we have grants to go back and assess what has been modified, what has changed based on the gaps analysis, and then focus on the greatest threats based upon the gaps analysis. So we actually do go back. It's not always right away, but you know, we go back and look at them years later and assess the progress and see where we made changes, where we didn't make changes, how successful it was, and what we need to do better next time.
Yeah, thank you. A little bit about Tip of the Mitt specifically. How many members are on your watershed council, and is there training for new members?
So we currently have about 2,300 members, and the only training we have for new members is if you become a volunteer. So we have volunteer opportunities for lake and stream monders, for avian botulism monders. So if you become a volunteer and offer to do one of those specific items, then we definitely train you. But other than that, you just get all of our information, and you're welcome to contact us at any point with any questions. Of course, anyone can do that at any point, but.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you everyone for your participation. We covered a lot of information today. Anne talked about why local protection is important for water resource features and the benefits of different local protection options. I discussed the various tools for local protection, focusing on developing wetland ordinances, natural feature setbacks. And then we had 3 really great presentations on vernal pool protection from Yumon Lee, West Bloomfield Township natural features ordinances and advice from John Rhoda, and some great details on all the successes and challenges and priorities from Tip of the Mitt's Jennifer McKay. So we really appreciate everyone's questions and engagement, and hopefully you can see from all of these presentations the overwhelming agreement at how crucial local governments are in implementing successful and efficient water resources protection.